Long before the word samurai took on the weight of legend, Japan's landscape was shaped by small bands of warriors whose lives were braided with the seasons and the rhythms of the land. In marshes and along river terraces, and the foothills where wild grasses whispered, communities built by early farmers learned to protect themselves against raiders and rival bands. These warriors were not yet samurai in name or armor, but their choices in battle, their loyalties, and their innovations in weapons and tactics would lay the foundations of a martial class. Over generations, the tasks of protection and leadership hardened into roles that required not only strength but also organization, and from this evolution the samurai would emerge. Point two paths. Be the raider or be the defender. Which would you choose? Subscribe and declare where you stand in the birth of the samurai. The shift from a hunter-gatherer world to settled paddies in the Yayoi period transformed social life and sowed the first seeds of militarization. As wet rice cultivation spread, land became a source of wealth and conflict, and those who could command labor and defend fields gained status. Foot soldiers and spear carriers walked the soft, irrigated earth where once hunters had roamed, and the concept of defending territory started to intertwine with ideas of lineage and honor. Power began to accrue to local chieftains who could marshal men, and those men learned that discipline and coordination mattered as much as individual valor. By the Kofun period, tombs rose like low hills across the countryside, and the elites who commissioned them began to show a new kind of power. They organized groups of retainers, attendants, and armed followers who could enforce their will beyond the borders of a single village. This era saw the first stirrings of a warrior ethos, because the ability to project force became an essential complement to aristocratic prestige. These early armed bands were diverse in equipment and methods, but they shared a developing sense of identity tied to the protection of their lord's authority. The influence of the Chinese and Korean mainland brought not only writing and ritual, but also military ideas that helped crystallize the function of armed retainers. As Yamato rulers sought to extend centralized power, they relied on provincial clans to administer distant lands and to suppress resistance. In return, those clans gained privileges and responsibilities, and their leaders honed skills at mobilizing men and resources. What began as ad hoc levies slowly transformed into more stable groups of professional fighters attached to particular families and territories. A critical moment came with the spread of horseback riding and mounted archery, innovations that reshaped tactics and raised the prestige of those who mastered them. The first horsemen in Japan were not mounted knights as in Europe, but archers who could strike from a mobile platform, skirting the edges of pitched infantry battles. Mastery of the horse demanded not only physical skill but also an investment in training, equipment, and animals, which tended to concentrate military capacity among wealthier households. Over time, the mounted archer became an emblem of elite warrior status, and the image of a horseman on the field began to eclipse that of the foot soldier in cultural imagination. During the Heian period, court life at Kyoto was dominated by poetry, ceremony, and the intricate etiquette of aristocracy, but the provinces simmered with practical concerns about land and defense. The great estates that supported the court were vulnerable to local disputes and theft, and aristocratic families often delegated protection to local strongmen. These men were the precursors to the samurai, retainers whose loyalty to a household could mean the difference between the estate's survival and its loss. As control over land became more contested, the need for trusted warriors who could be relied upon in both law and battle became unmistakable. Two pivotal conflicts in the 12th century exposed the fissures between courtly order and military necessity and made the samurai central to national politics. The Hagen and Heiji disturbances were more than brief uprisings. They were power struggles where warrior families like the Minamoto and Taira tested their influence against the imperial court. These clashes demonstrated that force on the ground, not only ritual at court, would determine the future of authority in Japan. The pattern of private armies acting in the name of clan interests set the stage for a military order that would come to dominate the next centuries. The Genpei War that followed was a decisive crucible that would transform Japan's political landscape and consecrate the samurai as a ruling class. For 5 turbulent years from 1180 to 1185, rival clans fought across rivers, plains, and coasts, using tactics that blended cavalry maneuvers with naval engagements and surprise raids. The Minamoto victory at Dan-no-Ura did more than topple a rival family. It ushered in a new system in which military leaders held real political authority through offices that controlled lands and legal privileges. From this conflict emerged the Kamakura shogunate, a government centered on martial rule rather than courtly ceremony. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate under Minamoto no Yoritomo marked the beginning of feudal governance in Japan, where military governors and judicial officers administered lands and dispensed justice. The shogun, though nominally subordinate to the emperor, claimed practical authority by commanding the loyalty of provincial warriors and by appointing stewards to manage estates. These stewards, known as Jito, and military governors, called Shugo, became the institutional basis for samurai power, linking land management directly to military obligation. This arrangement made the samurai both landholders and enforcers, a fusion that shaped social hierarchies for centuries. Under the Kamakura regime, a distinct samurai culture began to take shape, one built on codes of loyalty, the cultivation of martial skill, and an austere aesthetic that prized restraint. The earliest recorded values were rooted in battlefield exigencies, obedience, courage, and readiness to die for one's lord. But samurai life was more than fighting. It involved administration, legal arbitration, and the stewardship of estates. Those responsibilities demanded literacy and knowledge of law, so the emergent warrior class increasingly blended martial ability with bureaucratic competence. The weapons and armor of the era reflected both practical needs and changing technologies. Early samurai favored composite bows for their range and mobility, complemented by spears and early forms of body protection. Armor evolved in response to the needs of mounted combat and the realities of the battlefield, using lacquered plates and laced construction that balanced protection with flexibility. The sword, while present throughout, would later become the most potent symbol of samurai identity, but its elevation was gradual and tied to ritual as well as combat effectiveness. Religious and philosophical currents also shaped samurai identity in these formative centuries. Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on discipline, meditation, and acceptance of death, found fertile ground among warrior elites seeking mental steadiness in the face of violence. Shinto customs and ancestor veneration reinforced loyalties to lineage and land, giving sacred meaning to familial obligations. The interplay of ritual, ethics, and practical discipline helped to frame an ethos where the acceptance of mortality, clarity of purpose, and devotion to duty became central virtues. The Kamakura period did not rest unchallenged, and the experience of resisting external threats further molded samurai institutions. In the late 13th century, the Mongol invasions tested Japan's capacity for collective defense and exposed limitations in feudal military structures. Although the invaders failed, in part due to storms that swept their fleets away, the cost of maintaining readiness and the failure to reward many warriors adequately during the crisis caused strains within the samurai class. The need for strengthened coastal defenses and tightened military organization accelerated the transition from local retainer bands to more formalized military hierarchies. The Hojo Regency, ruling as de facto leaders during much of the Kamakura era, showed how power in feudal Japan could be exercised through bureaucratic control of military offices. They managed succession, appointed officials, and mediated disputes, relying on a network of vassalage that bound lesser warriors to their authority. This system blurred the lines between administration and martial service, and it taught samurai how to operate within institutions as well as on the battlefield. Over time, the capacity to govern as well as to fight became a hallmark of warrior leadership. As centuries advanced, new centers of power arose in the provinces, and the authority of the Kamakura shogunate waned under the weight of internal conflict and economic strain. Warring factions within the warrior aristocracy challenged the status quo, and the eventual fall of Kamakura in 1333 opened a period of fragmentation and renewal. These shifts were not merely political. They affected how samurai conceived their role in society, alternating between service to central authority and competition for regional dominance. The oscillation between unity and division became a persistent feature of feudal Japan. The Muromachi period that followed saw the Ashikaga shogunate attempt to balance the ambitions of powerful regional lords with the need for centralized oversight, but the system proved fragile. Daimyo, local lords empowered by landholdings and military clout, asserted autonomy and built their own networks of retainers, castles, and economic bases. Warfare became increasingly localized, yet sophisticated, as rulers invested in fortifications, logistics, and the arts of statecraft. Samurai adapted to these conditions by developing bureaucratic faculties alongside martial prowess, making governance and warfare inseparable professions. In the chaos of the 15th and 16th centuries, Japan moved into the Sengoku, or Warring States, era, a time of intense competition where the very shape of samurai life transformed. Daimyo fought not only over land but over the means of production and the loyalty of peasants, merchants, and lesser warriors. The need to supply armies, engineer sieges, and manage economies elevated talents in administration, diplomacy, and innovation. This period made samurai commanders into proto-statesmen, blending military daring with managerial skill to build durable polities. Militarily, the Sengoku age saw changes in weapons technology and tactics that altered the battlefield. The introduction of firearms by Portuguese traders in the mid-16th century revolutionized warfare, forcing samurai to reassess formations and tactics and to integrate a Shigeru foot soldiers more centrally into armies. Castles grew larger and more complex, becoming not only military bastions but centers of governance and symbols of a lord's power. Armies expanded in scale, logistics became crucial, and the nature of command evolved into something more systematic and bureaucratic than ever before. Amidst this turbulence, three figures stand as agents of dramatic change who would reshape Japan's path and redefine what it meant to be a warrior in a changing world. Oda Nobunaga, with his ruthlessness and appetite for innovation, used firearms and strategic audacity to break traditional power structures. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, his successor, consolidated many of those gains through political acumen, redistributing land, and formalizing systems of social control. Tokugawa Ieyasu, in turn, completed the transition by establishing a durable shogunate that would impose order and reconfigure samurai roles for a new era. The establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate at the beginning of the 17th century created a peace that lasted 2.5 centuries, and it therefore reshaped samurai life profoundly. Deprived of constant warfare, many samurai shifted from battlefield roles to bureaucratic and administrative functions, serving as magistrates, tax collectors, and overseers of local governance. Their identity adapted, the sword remained a symbol, but daily life centered on paperwork, judicial duties, and the maintenance of status. The samurai class became a hereditary elite with privileges and obligations codified by the shogunate. Under Tokugawa rule, the social hierarchy crystallized, and strict class distinctions sought to define the duties and lifeways of samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. Samurai were expected to embody moral rectitude and loyalty, and they were often the only class officially permitted to carry two swords, a public marker of their standing. Yet beneath the veneer of stoic honor, many warriors faced financial hardship as stipends failed to keep pace with inflation and urban costs. This contrast between cultural prestige and economic strain would become a recurring tension in samurai history. Education and cultural refinement became central to samurai identity during the Edo period, as many warriors cultivated calligraphy, poetry, and the study of martial classics to sustain their status in a peaceful society. Confucian teachings, with their emphasis on hierarchical obligations, filial piety, and ethical governance, were woven into the moral fabric that samurai were expected to uphold. Martial training continued, but it increasingly coexisted with contemplative practices and an appreciation for aesthetics. The samurai ideal grew to encompass not just the capacity to fight but the capacity to govern and to embody virtue. Although the term Bushido would later be used to describe the way of the warrior, the code that governed samurai conduct was never a single unified doctrine. Instead, it was a composite of influences: Buddhist acceptance of death, Shinto reverence for ancestors, Confucian duty, and practical norms developed on the battlefield. This plurality allowed for regional variations and individual interpretations, and it meant that samurai values were as flexible as they were demanding. Across centuries, what counted as honorable behavior would be negotiated in courtrooms as often as on battlefields. Material culture, swords, armor, tea bowls, and architecture became vehicles for expressing samurai ideals and for reinforcing social boundaries. The katana evolved not only as a functional weapon but as an object imbued with ritual meaning, its forging process entwined with craft, spirituality, and lineage. Armor designs reflected both technological needs and aesthetic sensibilities, and castles illustrated how military necessity and symbolic power could converge in stone and timber. Objects and spaces shaped the samurai world because they provided visible marks of authority and continuity. Parallel to the elite warrior families, the Ashigaru, or foot soldiers, played a crucial role in the formation of samurai armies and eventually in the social structure of feudal Japan. Often drawn from peasant ranks, Ashigaru could rise in status through military service, and in some cases they became samurai themselves. Their increasing professionalization during the Sengoku period made them indispensable in large-scale conflicts, and their use of firearms and massed formations altered the nature of combat. The dynamics between mounted samurai and these foot soldiers reflected broader trends of social mobility and military innovation. The administration of land and justice under feudal arrangements required samurai to master legal codes and bureaucratic procedures, tasks that were as vital to their power as prowess in combat. Samurai served as magistrates who resolved disputes, collected taxes, and enforced estate rules, blending martial authority with legal responsibility. These duties necessitated literacy and knowledge of precedent, and over time the warrior class developed an administrative vocabulary that allowed shoguns and daimyo to govern widely dispersed territories. The capacity to administer effectively reinforced the legitimacy of samurai leadership. Marriages and alliances among warrior families were tools of statecraft that extended the reach of samurai power beyond the battlefield. Families negotiated pacts through kinship as much as through force, using marriage to secure loyalties, to combine resources, and to legitimize claims to land. Such alliances could alter the balance of power without a single sword drawn, and they underscored the social sophistication of feudal politics. Over generations, networks of kinship knitted together a complex web that supported both local authority and centralized governance. While samurai ideals emphasized loyalty, moments of betrayal and rebellion were frequent enough to remind rulers of the precariousness of their power. Uprisings by disgruntled vassals, peasant revolts, and competing ambitions among daimyo created perpetual challenges for any regime seeking long-term stability. The management of honor and reward, the dispensation of justice, and the distribution of land were constant instruments through which rulers sought to prevent fragmentation. The art of governance in feudal Japan often meant navigating a landscape of competing claims with enough force and grace to sustain order. The economic underpinning of samurai power relied heavily on agricultural production, particularly rice, which functioned as the basic unit of wealth and taxation. Domains were assessed in terms of kakudaka, a system that measured productive capacity and determined stipends and obligations. This link between agrarian output and military capacity meant that wars were as much about controlling harvests and granaries as they were about seizing castles. Effective stewardship of land was thus central to a samurai's capacity to maintain his household and to mobilize armed retainers when required. The interplay between peasants and warriors shaped much of social life, because samurai depended on rural labor to sustain their households and to fulfill military obligations. Peasant communities were bound to the land through both custom and law, and their production supported not only local elites but the samurai class at large. Yet these relationships were dynamic. Peasant resistance, migration, and economic innovation could erode the power of lords just as easily as conquest could expand it. The balance between coercion and accommodation defined the rhythms of rural governance under feudal rule. Urban centers and castle towns emerged as focal points where samurai, merchants, and artisans intersected, creating new spaces of social complexity and economic exchange. These towns concentrated administrative functions, workshops, and markets, making them hubs for the redistribution of goods and the dissemination of ideas. Samurai households in these urban environments often had to navigate proximity to commerce and to manage relationships with non-warrior classes. Cities thus became places where samurai identity interacted with the practicalities of everyday economic life. Cultural patronage was another realm where samurai exercised influence, sponsoring temples, gardens, and the arts as expressions of taste and legitimacy. Tea ceremonies, ink painting, and the study of poetry became means by which warriors signaled refinement and moral seriousness. Patronage also functioned as a political tool, tying local elites to religious institutions and talented craftsmen whose skills reinforced the prestige of the patron. Over time, the aesthetic choices of samurai shaped a distinctive cultural landscape that merged martial and artistic values. The role of religion continued to be complex, providing solace, justification for violence, and a framework for ethical conduct. Buddhism offered practices for confronting mortality and for cultivating detachment, while Shinto rites connected warriors to place and ancestry. Temple samurai relationships could be cooperative, competitive, or opportunistic, depending on local circumstances, and religious authorities sometimes contested secular power. The moral vocabulary of religion informed the narratives of legitimacy that samurai used to justify their authority. As the centuries of feudal rule wore on, the samurai class also produced a rich corpus of literature and philosophy that reflected its shifting concerns. Manuals on strategy mingled with reflections on duty, and literature explored the tensions between personal desire and public obligation. These works provided a repository of images and prescriptions that later generations would draw upon to construct an idealized view of the warrior past. Whether practical or poetic, samurai writings chronicled the dilemmas of a class that bore both arms and responsibilities. The practice of law in samurai domains adapted to the realities of local power and custom, producing a patchwork of legalities that could be both flexible and harsh. Lords adjudicated disputes, enforced contracts, and punished offenses with a discretion that reflected the local balance of interests. Written codes and oral traditions operated in tandem, and the effective administration of justice became crucial for maintaining social order. Samurai who excelled as judges and administrators gained prestige as well as control, reinforcing the fusion of martial and civil authority. Training and pedagogy for warriors varied by period and place, but the emphasis on discipline, technique, and psychological readiness remained constant. Young men of samurai families learned horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and the arts of strategy from an early age, but they also received instruction in calligraphy, ethics, and governance. Mentorship and apprenticeship within households created networks of loyalty that extended beyond blood ties, while ritualized practices inculcated values that smoothed the transition from youth to adult responsibility. The cultivation of mind and body was thus an enduring theme in samurai formation. The symbolism of death and the willingness to accept it as part of duty had deep implications for samurai behavior and for how society understood sacrifice. Acts of ritual suicide, whether rare and dramatic or more diffuse in the form of accepting fatal risk, became entwined with notions of loyalty and the maintenance of honor. These practices were not uniform nor always celebrated, but they left an imprint on cultural narratives about what it meant to serve. The boundary between courage and self-destruction was negotiated in stories, laws, and the memories of communities. Foreign contacts periodically altered samurai practice and perception, from early continental influences to the arrival of European traders and missionaries in the 16th century. These encounters introduced new technologies, religions, and ideas that samurai leaders could adopt, adapt, or resist according to their political needs. The presence of firearms, for example, changed the calculus of battle and prompted tactical and social adjustments. Exchanges with the outside world reminded samurai that their traditions were part of a broader, dynamic set of human practices. By the time the Tokugawa peace took hold, the transformation of the samurai from frontier warriors to a bureaucratic class was well advanced, yet the memory of battlefield glory retained cultural power. Rituals, memorials, and family histories preserved martial narratives even as daily life shifted to administration and cultural refinement. This layering of identities meant that samurai could draw from both civic competence and a warrior past when asserting authority. The past remained a living resource for legitimating present roles. The relationship between samurai and imperial authority was another strand in the tapestry of feudal politics, sometimes cooperative and sometimes tense. While shoguns often ruled in the emperor's name, the real locus of power could be contested, negotiated, and reimagined across centuries. The coexistence of an imperial court and military government created a duality where ritual legitimacy and coercive power needed one another. Samurai leaders learned how to navigate this duality, balancing symbolic respect with the exercise of practical control. Throughout the feudal era, the concept of loyalty was not simple obedience, but a complex negotiation of mutual obligation, reward, and personal honor. Vassalage bound retainers to lords through promises of protection and land, and these relationships depended on expectations of competence and justice. When a lord failed in his obligations, the social contract frayed, sometimes leading to revolt or defection. The vitality of feudal governance rested on the capacity of leaders to maintain reciprocal trust and to project credible authority. Economic innovations, such as improved irrigation, better roads, and the growth of markets, altered the material conditions that supported samurai households and their retainers. Greater agricultural productivity could expand the resources available for military maintenance, but commercial growth also empowered merchants who challenged traditional hierarchies. Samurai had to adjust to a marketplace that offered new sources of wealth and new forms of influence, and some embraced commerce while others resisted it to preserve status distinctions. The interplay between economy and status continually reshaped the landscape of power. The daily rhythms of samurai households combined ritual, administration, and the management of retainers and dependents, creating a domestic world that reinforced public authority. Households operated as microcosms of governance, with senior men instructing juniors, allocating labor, and resolving disputes internally. The household economy was a unit of political power because it provided men, material, and legitimacy to the larger domain. Domestic order and public authority thus reinforced one another in the life of the warrior class. Regional variation in practices, attire, and customs meant that the samurai of Kyushu experienced different pressures than those of the Tohoku or Kansai regions. Yet shared values knitted them into a broader warrior culture. Climate, geography, and local histories influenced military needs and social structures, producing diverse modes of lordship and resistance. This diversity allowed for experimentation and adaptation, which proved essential in times of upheaval. The plurality of samurai experiences complicates any singular account of their origins and functions. Education of the populace, including peasants and merchants, often relied on the institutions and patronage networks controlled by samurai, which further entrenched their role as cultural leaders. Schools and temple-based education taught literacy, arithmetic, and moral precepts, often reinforcing the social order that privileged warriors. By shaping the channels of knowledge, samurai families helped to preserve social hierarchies even as they fostered intellectual life. The institutions of learning thus became conduits of ideological as well as administrative power. The end of the medieval age brought new intellectual currents that questioned the foundations of feudal order, and samurai responded in varied ways. Some embraced reform and engaged with new ideas about governance and economics, while others doubled down on traditional codes and rituals to sustain legitimacy. Debates about moral leadership and the responsibilities of rulers reflected deeper anxieties about the sustainability of a class defined by arms in a changing world. The internal conflicts of samurai thought mirrored the external contests over land and authority. As centralized authorities attempted to impose uniform policies, regional lords sometimes resisted, negotiating the limits of their subordination with skill and tenacity. The tension between centralization and local autonomy is a recurring theme in the history of feudal Japan and a driver of both conflict and innovation. Some samurai prospered by aligning with centers of power, while others carved out independence that made them semi-autonomous rulers of their domains. The negotiation of power was a constant process rather than a static condition. The rituals that surrounded succession in samurai families were charged moments where claims to authority either consolidated or splintered. The transmission of land, titles, and responsibilities often required ceremonial affirmation and practical negotiation among retainers and allied families. Disputes over inheritance could ignite internecine conflict, and the stability of a domain often depended on how smoothly succession was managed. Ceremonial practice and practical politics thus intersected in the most intimate of family affairs. Samurai poets and chroniclers recorded battles, laments, and ideals, giving us a window into the emotional landscape of a warrior society. Their verses could mourn the loss of comrades, praise feats of arms, or reflect on the costs of service. Literature became a mirror where samurai could examine the tensions between personal feeling and public duty, and it preserved narratives that would shape future identities. The cultural memory of the samurai was sustained by these artistic productions as much as by legal codes and military practice. As the feudal era matured, so did the technology of war and the organizational structures that supported it, creating a military-industrial ecology that centered on samurai needs. Blacksmiths, armorers, and carpenters formed networks of artisans who specialized in the tools of war and governance. The circulation of materials and skills linked rural production to urban markets and to the exigencies of defense, making the samurai both patrons and consumers in a complex economy. The materiality of power relied on craftsmen whose labor was essential to sustaining feudal authority. By the time foreign pressure and internal contradictions culminated in the upheavals of the 19th century, the samurai had been a central pillar of Japanese society for nearly a millennium, their identity shaped by a long arc from local protectors to bureaucratic elites. Their origins in early warrior bands, their evolution through the rise of horse-mounted archers, and their adaptation to feudal institutions created a class uniquely attuned to the needs of a land divided into domains and loyalties. The samurai story is a story of adaptation, of ritual and violence, of governance and culture woven together. Understanding their origins helps us see how a society organized around land, lineage, and loyalty could sustain a distinctive martial civilization for centuries. Long ago, on the islands of Japan, a warrior class arose whose life and reputation would echo across centuries. They called themselves samurai, a term that would come to mean far more than mere swordsmanship. By examining their creed, the way they lived and died, we glimpse a world shaped by discipline, honor, and duty. The story of Bushido, the way of the warrior, is the thread that binds that world together and unspools a history both noble and conflicted. Bushido did not appear fully formed. It was a living code, shaped by centuries of practice and philosophy. The samurai learned as much from battlefield exigencies as from Zen meditation halls and Confucian classrooms. Their ethic folded together ideas of loyalty, courage, rectitude, benevolence, respect, honesty, and honor, but it also absorbed ritual, aesthetics, and legal obligations. To follow Bushido was to navigate a series of tensions between public duty and private feeling, between violence and restraint. In the early centuries, the warriors who would become samurai were provincial landholders and mounted retainers. During the Heian period, the central court in Kyoto grew increasingly distant from local disputes, and landed elites learned to rely on armed men to protect estates. These soldiers were skilled horsemen, archers, and swordsmen who cultivated relationships with patrons and gradually institutionalized their role. The term samurai would later come to describe an entire social stratum whose identity revolved around service and arms. One of the formative influences on samurai culture was Buddhism, especially its Zen schools. Zen taught a directness of mind, an acceptance of impermanence, and a discipline of meditation that translated well to the demands of combat. Sword practice became both physical training and spiritual exercise, a way to clear the mind and act without hesitation. When a samurai spoke of calmness in the face of death, he drew on a long conversation between Zen masters and sword masters about presence and emptiness. Confucian thought entered the samurai's moral vocabulary as well, especially during the Tokugawa period when scholars sought to codify social roles. Confucianism emphasized hierarchical harmony, filial piety, and the fidelity of duty that aligned with a samurai's obligation to his lord. It offered a language for loyalty and proper governance, reinforcing the idea that a samurai's life was not his own but bound to a web of obligations. Yet even as Confucian ideals strengthened social order, they layered additional expectations that could conflict with other aspects of the warrior's life. Shinto, the indigenous spirituality of Japan, also informed the samurai sense of identity, rooting them in ancestor veneration and the sacredness of the land. Shinto rituals marked births, marriages, and deaths, and warriors sought blessings at shrines before campaigns. The sacred and the martial coexisted, with swords often treated as talismans and symbols of divine favor. This blending of practical weaponry and spiritual significance made the samurai sword an emblem of both protection and religious meaning. From the martial perspective, the evolution of weapons technology shaped samurai practice. Early samurai were archers on horseback, using the yumi bao with skill demanding rhythm and distance. As battlefield tactics evolved, so too did the prominence of the sword, particularly the curved katana that could be drawn and used in tight quarters. Yet swords did not eliminate the spear, the bow, or the gun. Practical commanders used whatever tools served the strategy of the moment, and samurai adapted accordingly. Armor tells a parallel story of adaptation and aesthetics. Lamellar and plate designs protected the body while allowing mobility on horseback and on foot. Helmet crests and lacquered surfaces served both ceremonial and psychological functions, signaling rank and striking an image of invincibility. Armor was not merely functional, it was a display of craftsmanship and identity, crafted by artisans whose work fused metallurgy, lacquering, and symbolism into a single suit. As the medieval period gave way to the age of constant warfare known as the Sengoku era, the samurai found themselves in an environment that tested every precept of Bushido. Local lords, called daimyo, vied for territory, and the battlefield became the crucible where reputations were forged or destroyed. Loyalty, once flexible and personal, hardened into stricter bonds as contesting armies required reliable retainers. But war also produced mobility, opportunity, and, at times, ruthless pragmatism. In that turbulence, figures like Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged, each reshaping the samurai world. Nobunaga's decisive brutality dismantled old structures and introduced firearms with ruthless efficiency. Hideyoshi's campaigns unified vast regions and created a new social order, while his land surveys and edicts regulated the samurai's economic base. Ieyasu finally consolidated power at Sekigahara and founded a stable Tokugawa shogunate that would rule for more than 2 centuries, bringing both order and new constraints for the warrior class. The Tokugawa era, often called the Edo period, was paradoxically a golden age of peace and a time of decline in martial relevance. With constant civil war ended, samurai were suddenly administrators, bureaucrats, and keepers of tradition rather than constant warriors. Their stipends and status were tied to service in castle towns and provincial offices, and many adapted to roles as magistrates, teachers, and managers. Yet the ideal of the warrior remained central to their self-image, and Bushido became a framework for conduct even when the sword was used mainly in ceremony. A central tension of the Edo period was economic. Stipends were often fixed in rice, measured in koku, and when inflation or poor harvest struck, many samurai families fell into debt. The cost of maintaining their status, lavish clothing, ceremonial obligations, and the upkeep of weapons and armor could outstrip income. Some samurai turned to scholarship, arts, or management of domain affairs, while others drifted into poverty or disgruntled idleness. This economic strain seeded a loosening of traditional bonds and produced a class of masterless samurai known as ronin. Ronin embodied both the romantic and the troubling sides of warrior culture. Stories of ronin avenging wrongs, such as the famed 47, captured the public imagination and reinforced ideals of loyalty and sacrifice. At the same time, groups of unemployed warriors could become threats to order, resorting to banditry or political agitation. The figure of the ronin became a symbol of disrupted social ties and the moral dilemmas of a class defined by service yet sometimes denied outlets for service. The ritual of seppuku, or ritual suicide, is one of the most vivid expressions of Bushido's demands. Seppuku offered a way to reclaim honor after disgrace or defeat, a controlled act that allowed a samurai to die with dignity rather than live shamed. The ceremony involved precise rites and witnesses, and the act itself was as much about community judgment as private grief. While modern observers often see seppuku as barbaric, in its cultural context it was a grim acknowledgement of the weight of responsibility under Bushido. Swordsmiths and the art of forging blades attained a near-mythic status in samurai culture. The process of folding steel, quenching, and tempering produced blades with a distinctive hamon, a visual record of the sword's edge. Masters like Masamune and Muramasa entered legend, and swords were passed down as family heirlooms, imbued with lineage and pride. The katana was not simply a tool, it was a moral and spiritual companion, an extension of the samurai's will and social standing. Yet not every sword was the work of a genius smith, and not every samurai was a master swordsman. Training occurred in ryu, schools of martial technique that preserved specific methods and philosophies. Some ryu emphasized precise forms and kata, structured patterns that taught body mechanics and timing. Others focused on strategy, multiple weapons, or the psychological art of killing without hesitation. These schools created continuity and variation within the martial culture, and instructors often held as much prestige as their noble patrons. Archery retained ceremonial and practical importance even as swordsmanship gained prominence. The Yumi Bao demanded a rhythm of breath akin to Zen practice, and horseback archery required a complex blending of balance and timing. Ritual archery like Yabusame became a public affirmation of martial spirit and a way for daimyo to display piety and prowess. The bao's slow, meditative character complemented the sword's immediacy, forming a broader spectrum of warrior skill. Most only watch. Few could master the balance, timing, and breath of the Yumi. Subscribe if you dare to train as they did. Mounted warfare and cavalry tactics were central until changing battlefield dynamics reduced their dominance. The samurai's training as horsemen gave them an advantage in mobility and shock action, and armor was designed to protect while permitting the techniques of horsemanship. As fortifications and massed infantry tactics changed warfare, the role of mounted samurai adapted, but the image of the mounted warrior remained potent in memory and ceremony. The horse itself was honored and often treated with reverence, another living link between man and martial identity. The arrival of firearms in the 16th century transformed battle in ways the samurai did not immediately master. Arquebus and later matchlocks altered tactics, enabling massed volleys and changing siegecraft. Some daimyo embraced the gun, integrating Ishiguro foot soldiers into their armies and using firearms to break samurai charges. Over time, this forced a reassessment of traditional tactics and a pragmatic acceptance that technology could trump lineage when victory was at stake. Castle architecture evolved alongside changes in warfare, becoming expressions of power as much as defensive works. Massive stone bases, winding approach paths, and layered walls created imposing strongholds that controlled surrounding lands. Castle towns grew around these centers of power, becoming hubs of commerce, administration, and culture. For samurai, the castle was a symbol of lordly authority and a practical center from which governance and military planning flowed. The rice economy underpinned samurai life and status. Measuring wealth in koku created a system where stipends, taxation, and domain management were all assessed in rice production. This agricultural basis made samurai life intimately linked to peasant labor, even as social codes often held that warriors should not cultivate land. Domain administrators collected taxes, settled disputes, and tried to maintain productivity, and a failing harvest could disturb the delicate balance that sustained the samurai class. Education and letters became essential to samurai identity, especially during prolonged peace. Literacy, knowledge of Chinese classics, and competence in law and administration were prized among high-ranking warriors. Many samurai studied poetry, calligraphy, and classical texts, cultivating a cultured persona that complemented martial prowess. The ideal was a balanced individual who could both govern wisely and, if necessary, fight fiercely. The aesthetics of the samurai extended into tea, gardens, and theater. The tea ceremony offered a ritualized space for humility, attention to detail, and the cultivation of a disciplined sensibility. No theater resonated with themes of honor, loss, and supernatural retribution that mirrored the samurai's inner life. Gardens and ink painting expressed an appreciation for simplicity, impermanence, and the quiet dignity that Bushido extolled in private moments away from the clangor of arms. Women in samurai households held roles that deserved careful attention, often overlooked by romantic narratives. Anabugeisha, female warriors drawn from samurai families, sometimes took up arms to defend their homes and clans. Generally, women managed households, trained in practical weaponry for defense, and upheld family honor through marriage alliances and careful upbringing. Their lives were constrained by the same codes of duty but lived inside a different set of daily responsibilities, where influence was exercised through social networks and domestic authority. Legal codes and domain laws attempted to define honor and conduct, adjudicating disputes among samurai and between classes. Punishments, stipulations about marriage, and rules about bearing arms were part of a larger apparatus that sought to maintain order. At times, law served as a blunt instrument, curbing excesses and suppressing dissent, while at other moments it codified elite privilege. The samurai's identity was mediated by these structures, which both protected and limited their freedoms. The moral language of Bushido shifted over time, sometimes idealized retrospectively. In the twilight of the shogunate, reformers and intellectuals looked back and attempted to distill a coherent code, emphasizing loyalty to the emperor and nation. Writers like Naito Banatsu popularized a structured account of Bushido that resonated in the West, characterizing it as an ethical system comparable to chivalry. That framing carried both truth and simplification, for Bushido had never been a single homogeneous doctrine but a tapestry of competing values. Contact with the West in the mid-19th century forced a crisis of identity for samurai and the wider polity. Commodore Perry's arrival and unequal treaties highlighted Japan's vulnerability and accelerated debates about reform. Some samurai embraced modernization, studying Western military techniques and adopting firearms, while others clung to traditional methods and authority. The country polarized between those who sought to preserve older hierarchies and those who argued for national strengthening through new institutions. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked the end of shogunal rule and the formal end of the samurai as a legally privileged class. The new imperial government abolished stipends, sankinkotai obligations, and other institutions that had sustained samurai status. Many warriors found new roles in the modernizing state as army officers, bureaucrats, or entrepreneurs, applying their discipline to the building of a nation. Others resisted, seeing the changes as an affront to honor, and some paid with their lives in rebellions like the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. The adoption of conscription and the creation of a modern army transformed martial identity but also tested the samurai ethos. Military service became a civic duty rather than a hereditary vocation, and officers promoted by merit rather than birth suggested a new hierarchy. Yet older values persisted and bled into the modern military, where loyalty and personal courage remained prized. The samurai's moral legacy thus shifted from class privilege to shaping national ideals about soldierly conduct. Modernization also affected arms culture and the symbolic power of the sword. Swords were banned for public wear, then permitted again, and they transitioned from everyday tools to ceremonial objects. The image of the sword persisted in literature and ritual, even as factory-made weapons and modern tactics dominated actual combat. Swords became relics of a vanished world, carried in memory and museum halls, but still sparking stories of honor and sacrifice. Critics of Bushido point to contradictions and abuses that the code enabled. Loyalty could be demanded to tyrants, and the ideal of unquestioning obedience sometimes justified brutal suppression. The romanticization of seppuku and violent loyalty had darker applications, particularly when invoked to stifle dissent or to rationalize militarism. An honest history recognizes both the moral excellence Bushido could inspire and the ways it was manipulated for political ends. At the same time, Bushido offered real ethical resources that many found admirable: a commitment to duty, restraint in victory, and care for the weak. Benevolence, as one of the stated virtues, compelled some samurai to govern justly and to exercise power with compassion. The tension between compassion and the readiness to kill is one of Bushido's central paradoxes, and understanding it requires looking at concrete lives rather than abstractions. Literary texts and drama preserved and amplified samurai ideals, shaping public imagination across classes. Tales of loyalty and revenge, of tragic fidelity and calculated cunning, proliferated in novels, kabuki, and later in film. The stories were not mere propaganda, they were moral experiments, scenarios where audiences could witness choices and consequences. Through these narratives, the samurai world continued to speak to later generations, offering guidance, warning, and myth. Names like Miyamoto Musashi and Yamamoto Tsunetomo anchor Bushido in individual example. Musashi, with his dual-wielding techniques and his Book of Five Rings, epitomized a synthesis of strategy and aesthetics. Tsunetomo's Hagakure, written later, celebrated a rigorous, almost fatalistic devotion to duty that influenced both samurai and non-samurai audiences. These works functioned as manuals and meditations, offering both practical advice and metaphysical reflection on the warrior's place in the world. Yamaga Soko and other military theorists attempted more systematic digestions of warrior ethics. They argued that the samurai's profession demanded moral refinement as much as tactical skill, suggesting that inner cultivation made for better service. These thinkers linked discipline on the battlefield with an ethical architecture for governance, envisioning a class of rulers trained both in arms and in moral judgment. Their writings show how samurai thought evolved from pragmatic habits to intellectual doctrines. The rituals of daily samurai life were as telling as their battlefield exploits. Morning inspections, ritual cleaning of weapons, the selection of clothing based on rank and season, and the observance of funerary rites all structured time and identity. Such practices inculcated habits of attention and an aesthetic of care that matched the seriousness of their public duties. A samurai's day was a sequence of small ceremonies that together reinforced a coherent sense of self and obligation. Medical and healing practices among samurai were practical and rooted in traditional medicine, but they also carried ritual elements. Wounds were treated with herbal poultices, and surgeons developed techniques for treating battlefield trauma. The fear of sepsis and the limits of pre-modern medicine meant that the samurai lived with a pragmatic acceptance of mortality. Yet this acceptance did not dull the pursuit of skill, and many samurai sought to ensure they could die in a state of dignity by keeping themselves fit and prepared. The international imagination of the samurai gained momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as the West encountered Japanese culture. Foreign observers often framed samurai values in ways that reflected their own ideals, comparing them to European chivalry and finding in Bushido a romantic ethic. This mutual fascination influenced diplomacy, literature, and art, with Japanese aesthetics becoming fashionable in Europe and America. The samurai image thus became a global symbol of an exotic nobility. Within Japan, the reinterpretation of Bushido in the modern era served nationalist aims at times, as leaders sought myths that could unify a diverse populace. The ideal of self-sacrifice for the nation was invoked to mobilize citizens in wars and to justify state policies. These appropriations of samurai imagery demonstrate how cultural resources can be repurposed by political movements. The samurai ethic could be noble in private and dangerous in public, depending on who invoked it and why. In daily life, the ordinary samurai household contained a tension between public display and private austerity. Ceremonial rooms for guests were arranged according to rank and propriety, while private rooms held family altars and symbols of lineage. Children were educated in both martial and literary arts, taught to respect elders and to understand their place in a chain of duty. The home was therefore a small state where larger values were practiced in microcosm. The samurai's relationship with peasants, artisans, and merchants was complex and regulated by law, but it could also be pragmatic and humane. While social hierarchy placed merchants at the bottom and samurai at the top, daily interactions required cooperation, negotiation, and sometimes paternal benevolence. Some daimyo fostered economic innovation and protected artisans, seeing prosperity as a foundation for stability. The samurai thus often acted as stewards and patrons as well as commanders. Cultural production in the Edo period flourished, and samurai taste influenced trends in poetry, painting, and theater. Many samurai became patrons of artists or artists themselves, composing waka and haiku, or painting simple ink studies that celebrated transience and form. This cultivation of aesthetic sensibility was not mere decoration, it was a discipline that sharpened perception and patience. The artistically inclined samurai practiced refinement as a complement to their martial focus. Training regimes combined hard physical conditioning with intellectual study, and for many samurai the two were inseparable. Practice drills, sparring, and weapons maintenance built muscle memory, while reading classics and practicing calligraphy honed attention and temperament. The integration of body and mind created warriors who could act decisively without belligerence, whose clarity of judgment in crisis derived from a lifetime of disciplined habit. The Ryu schools emphasized this unity, teaching forms that trained both physical pathways and mental patterns. The social rituals surrounding death reflected the samurai's persistent engagement with mortality. Funeral rites, memorial tablets, and the reading of Buddhist sutras ensured that the dead were honored and that lineage continuity was affirmed. Family gravesites became spaces of both mourning and moral instruction, where descendants learned about ancestors' sacrifices. Death was thus woven into the moral tapestry of family life, an occasion for reflection on the costs of duty. Martial strategy among samurai leaders was a blend of intuition, intelligence gathering, and the hard lessons of experience. Commanders used scouts, signals, and terrain to gain advantage, and they practiced psychology as much as tactics. Surprise attacks, flanking maneuvers, and the coordinated use of spearmen, archers, and gunners became part of the commander's repertoire. Great leaders combined audacity with careful preparation, understanding that victory often turned on small margins of discipline and timing. Music and sound played roles in samurai culture, from the drumbeats that coordinated troops to the flute melodies of courtly performance. Music could inspire courage or still the nerves before battle, and it also framed ritual life in households and shrines. The samurai appreciated sound as a cultural medium, and their ceremonies were accompanied by rhythms and songs that etched social memory into the air. Sound thus complemented visual and tactile dimensions of identity, making ritual a multisensory affair. Hospitality in samurai households followed strict codes designed to show respect while maintaining rank. Guests were received according to their status. Tea was served with deliberate slowness, and the choreography of entrance and seating reflected social hierarchies. Hospitality was a political practice as much as a moral virtue, fostering alliances and reinforcing bonds between patrons and retainers. The careful performance of etiquette was another domain where Bushido's discipline shaped life. Religious pilgrimages and visits to shrines were common among samurai, often as preparations for campaigns or as acts of thanksgiving. Stopping at a shrine to pray for victory or to offer thanks after a campaign linked personal fate to a broader spiritual order. Such acts also reinforced the samurai's sense of humility before forces larger than the individual, balancing confidence and skill with recognition of limits. Rituals of supplication and gratitude helped integrate the martial into the religious fabric of daily life. Poetry and brevity were central to samurai expression. A well-turned verse could convey meaning more enduringly than bragging. Haiku and tanka sharpened perception and taught restraint, making precise images carry moral weight. Composing verse was a discipline that required attention to nature and human feeling, and the samurai's practice of writing became a mirror for interior control. Words thus served as tools for shaping character, not merely for decoration. The interplay between central authority and local power defined much of samurai political life, and daimyo had to manage both loyalty and possibility of rebellion. They maintained retainers, collected taxes, and built networks of marriage and patronage to preserve domains. Central shogunal authority tried to regulate these networks through laws and inspections, but enforcement depended on the balance of power and the skill of administrators. Politics for the samurai was less an abstract game than daily negotiations over resources, reputation, and survival. Foreign trade influenced samurai domains by introducing goods and ideas that altered consumption and taste. Silk, porcelain, and spices reached castle towns, enriching aesthetic life and sometimes creating economic shifts. Daimyo who encouraged trade could enrich their domains, but increased liquidity also disrupted older modes of status display tied to rice production. The global exchange of goods and knowledge nudged the samurai world into a broader set of possibilities, complicating traditional hierarchies. Education systems within domains varied, with some daimyo founding schools that taught both Confucian ethics and practical administration. Samurai children learned to read, calculate taxes, and understand legal codes, preparing them for bureaucratic roles. These schools also nurtured intellectual life, producing scholars who debated governance and moral questions. The cultivation of administrative competence contributed to the peaceful governance that characterized much of the Tokugawa period. Sports and recreation, including sumo and horseback games, gave samurai outlets for competition and skill display. Such activities maintained physical fitness and offered socially acceptable arenas for aggression. Tournaments and demonstrations served both as entertainment and as public tests of prowess, allowing individuals to increase reputation without resorting to destructive violence. Leisure thus functioned as social glue, channeling energies into ritualized contests rather than open conflict. Medicine and hygiene within samurai households improved over time as practical knowledge spread and hospitals emerged in larger towns. The treatment of wounds, the management of epidemics, and the regulation of public health were increasingly formalized as domains matured. Samurai administrators faced the practical challenge of keeping populations healthy to ensure economic productivity and military readiness. Health thus became a policy issue as well as a private concern. The resonance of samurai values in later Japanese militarism shows how cultural ideals can be mobilized for state aims. The rhetoric of honor, sacrifice, and devotion to leader was used to galvanize communities for national projects and wars. While many individuals genuinely believed in these ideals, the state's use of them simplified and weaponized a complex tradition. This transformation underscores the need to separate Bushido's philosophical richness from its political deployments. In intimate relationships, marriage served both personal and strategic functions, securing alliances and carrying on family lines. Women were often educated in management and literacy to fulfill their roles as estate managers and moral custodians. Familial expectations emphasized harmony and duty, and domestic life reflected larger social priorities about lineage and reputation. The household was therefore a crucible in which the ethics of loyalty and service were practiced daily. Samurai stories often hinge on moments of decision where honor conflicts with expedience, and those moments reveal the code's human costs. Choosing between loyalty to a lord and the welfare of a family, between obedience and justice, produced tragedies and moral heroism. These dilemmas permeate literature because they remain relevant to anyone balancing public role and private conscience. Bushido's power lies in this capacity to pose hard questions rather than offering simple answers. The spiritual practice of meditation sharpened emotional control and clarity of judgment, enabling samurai to face violence without panic. Zen techniques cultivated an equanimity that allowed swift action free from fear or hesitation. That mental training was not mystical fluff, it had practical implications for survival and leadership. Calm in danger, the samurai could act decisively and with moral clarity, attributes admired in both wartime and governance. The aesthetics of restraint encouraged samurai to value simplicity, understatement, and the beauty of imperfection. Wabi-sabi, an aesthetic that finds depth in impermanence and modesty, influenced gardens, tea implements, and the patina of lacquered surfaces. Such taste reflected a philosophical orientation that prized the essential over the ornate. In everyday life, the samurai's preference for the simple was an ethical stance as much as an artistic one. Over time, samurai patronage stimulated craft traditions, from sword-making to lacquer work and textile weaving. These crafts benefited from the patronage of daimyo and wealthy samurai who commissioned objects both for use and display. The artisans developed specialized techniques, passing knowledge through apprenticeships and forming guild-like structures. The material culture of the samurai thus supported a thriving arts economy that extended beyond the warrior class into broader society. Rites of passage marked transitions for samurai, from coming-of-age ceremonies to promotions and funerals. Each rite reinforced hierarchy and community memory, connecting individual lives to ancestral lines and clan fortunes. The formalization of these moments created continuity across generations, embedding identity in ritual practice. Through ceremony, the ephemeral life of a person became part of a longer narrative about family and duty. Samurai involvement in agriculture management showed that their role was not limited to battlefields and halls. Many were administrators responsible for increased productivity and infrastructure. Irrigation projects, tax reforms, and dispute resolution were part of a samurai's repertoire as a domain official. Competent administration meant more stable stipends and less unrest, so effective governance was in the samurai's material interest as well as moral duty. The warrior thus blended martial and civic virtues in practice. Popular culture in modern times has reimagined samurai through novels, manga, and films, sometimes sharpening the romantic edge and sometimes exposing tragedy. Directors like Kurosawa gave cinematic life to samurai dilemmas, blending visual power with ethical tension. Contemporary authors revisit the era to explore themes of identity, change, and resilience, showing how the samurai story remains a useful lens for modern concerns. The persistent fascination reveals both the narrative power of the samurai and the human resonance of their ethical dilemmas. Military drills and formations under the samurai developed through centuries of experimentation and experience. Small unit cohesion, signaling methods, and coordinated attacks became more sophisticated as commanders learned to integrate different arms. The ability to maintain discipline under the stress of battle often proved decisive, and samurai leaders invested heavily in training subordinates. Discipline was a multiplier of force, transforming individual skill into collective effectiveness. The role of spies, scouts, and intelligence networks in samurai campaigns highlights a pragmatic side of warfare often obscured by romantic images. Espionage, infiltration, and deception were legitimate techniques for gaining advantage and avoiding direct confrontation. Successful commanders used information to choose battlefields and manipulate enemy expectations. This emphasis on cunning demonstrates that samurai strategy prized minds as well as muscles. Philosophical debates among samurai often turned on the nature of courage and the value of life. Some thinkers insisted that death should be met without fear, that a warrior's clarity came from acceptance of the inevitable. Others argued that the preservation of life, when possible without dishonor, was preferable, advocating prudence and compassion. These arguments were not abstract. They guided choices on the battlefield and in governance, shaping when to press an attack and when to withdraw. Food and cuisine in samurai households balanced practicality with ritual, and meals could reflect both austerity and refinement. Seasonal ingredients were preferred, and the presentation of a meal followed rules that communicated respect and hierarchy. Culinary practice taught patience and attention to detail, and shared meals created social cohesion among retainers and lords. Even the simplest dish could be an occasion for moral instruction and collective memory. The design of samurai residences combined defense and domesticity, with gateways, inner courts, and rooms arranged for privacy and ceremony. The layout enabled both governance and family life, providing spaces for receiving guests and for private contemplation. Gardens offered a refuge from urban noise, modeled to evoke natural landscapes within limited space. The home was thus a training ground for the practiced behaviors of courtesy, vigilance, and aesthetic appreciation that Bushido required. Language and rhetoric among samurai included formulae for apologies, oaths, and declarations of fealty that carried legal and moral force. A spoken promise could bind a retainer's fate, and the skillful use of language managed alliances and mitigated conflict. Ritualized speech acted as a bridge between private thought and public commitment, making words an instrument of social fabric. The careful use of language thus became another avenue for demonstrating the discipline and reliability prized by Bushido. Leaders among samurai navigated succession crises and family disputes that could fragment domains. Handling succession with prudence, establishing clear lines of inheritance, and crafting marriage alliances were essential tasks for a daimyo. Soulful patience and political acumen both mattered, and mishandled transitions could invite rebellion or annexation. The governance skills required of samurai leaders proved that martial talent alone could not secure a domain's future. Seasonal cycles shaped samurai life, from agricultural rhythms to festival calendars that punctuated the year. Spring planting and autumn harvest created temporal anchors for economic life, while festivals allowed communities to renew social ties. The samurai participated in these cycles both as rulers and as members of local life, attending to obligations that connected them to the land and its people. Time itself was an institution, structured by cyclical duties and communal observances. Monastic orders sometimes served as both spiritual guides and political actors for samurai, with priests providing not only religious counsel but also tactical advice. Monasteries could be centers of learning, shelter, or even armed resistance, depending on their relationships with local lords. Samurai often sought monastic support for temple patronage or moral legitimacy, leading to entanglements between religious and secular power. These relationships show the porous boundary between spiritual authority and political life in pre-modern Japan. The visual symbols of samurai identity, mon, helmets, banners, functioned as quick identifiers on the battlefield and in peacetime. These emblems carried stories about lineage, victories, and alliances that observers could read at a glance. Heraldry thus functioned as social shorthand, compressing reputation and obligation into recognizable signs. In this way, identity was broadcast as both practical communication and symbolic assertion. Training for leadership included exposure to historical exemplars, campaigns, and the study of classics that taught prudence and virtue. The reading of past errors and triumphs formed a curriculum for younger samurai, allowing them to internalize patterns of success and failure. Memory of past battles shaped decision-making, and the historian's role in preserving these accounts was crucial for strategic learning. Institutional memory thus underlay both tactical competence and moral orientation. Art and craft were not simply leisure, they were ways to sharpen sensibility. The fastidious care that went into lacquerware or blade polishing required concentration and steadiness of hand similar to combat practice. Artisans and samurai sometimes exchanged techniques and sensibilities, finding in shared practice a mutual refinement of skill. The boundary between maker and warrior blurred when both sought excellence in craft and discipline. Travel and pilgrimage among samurai broadened horizons but also tested obligations, for movement required permission and could signal political intent. When samurai traveled, they navigated checkpoints, presented credentials, and managed appearances to maintain dignity and security. Travel allowed exchange of ideas and news, spreading innovations in tactics, couture, and philosophy. Movement across the islands thus knitted the polity more closely, even as it risked transmitting dissent and subversive thought. Tradecraft in arms and armor production became specialized, and certain regions gained reputations for superior steel or lacquer. Craftspeople honed techniques that were sometimes guarded secrets, passed within families from master to apprentice. The economic network supporting samurai life was therefore complex, involving urban merchants, rural producers, and domain administrators who negotiated supply chains. This material base sustained the cultural life of the warrior class and anchored it in economic reality. The psychological demands of being a samurai included dealing with trauma, loss, and the weight of expectation, experiences rarely discussed openly yet often central to inner life. Veterans carried memories of comrades lost and decisions that could haunt them for decades. Coping mechanisms included ritual, community support, and spiritual practice, yet the Stoic ideal could also inhibit emotional expression. This interior struggle shaped many lives in ways both poignant and tragic. Samurai diplomacy blended force and negotiation, with envoys using ritualized exchanges to communicate intent and secure agreements. Gifts, formal letters, and carefully choreographed receptions served as channels of policy as much as conversation. Skilled diplomats knew that ceremony could accomplish what threats or force could not, forging bonds of obligation through ritual exchange. Diplomatic practice thus reflected the samurai understanding that power was most durable when legitimized by shared norms and symbolic action. Children of samurai families were taught obedience and honor from an early age, often through imitation and example more than formal lectures. Games, supervised weapon drills, and storytelling conveyed the values of courage and loyalty. Education balanced physical training with moral instruction and writing practice, preparing young people for the responsibilities of adulthood. The upbringing process was a small-scale transmission of social code, intended to perpetuate a particular kind of person in the world. Environmental knowledge mattered for samurai planners who needed to use terrain to advantage, manage supplies, and anticipate weather. Understanding a mountain pass, a river crossing, or agricultural cycles could be the difference between victory and ruin. The natural world thus entered strategy not merely as backdrop but as active partner in campaigns. Some warrior leaders cultivated an almost ecological awareness, learning to harmonize plans with environmental rhythms. Festivals and communal celebrations often included martial demonstrations that displayed the pageantry and discipline of the warrior class to the populace. These events reassured people of order and offered samurai opportunities to reaffirm loyalty and competence publicly. The performative aspect of martial ritual helped legitimize authority and created shared narratives of identity. Public spectacle became a political tool for maintaining social cohesion. Shifts in clothing styles over centuries reflected changing tastes, economy, and status, with samurai adopting garments that signified rank while also balancing practicality for travel and combat. Fabrics, dyes, and cuts signaled alliances and preferences, and clothing choices were part of daily ritual for a class where appearance mattered. Through fabric and form, samurai broadcasted identity in a way both practical and symbolic. The transformation of samurai from feudal lords to modern citizens was uneven and often painful, as individuals reconciled a vanished social order with new national imperatives. Some adapted by entering new professions and embracing modern education, while others resentfully clung to old privileges. The squeeze of modernization therefore produced both innovation and resistance, shaping the trajectory of Japanese society beyond the warrior class itself. This period of transition contains an entire moral drama of adaptation and loss. The post-Meiji memory of samurai is contested and multifaceted, with some emphasizing their virtues and others their failures. Museums, films, and academic debates continue to reassess what the samurai meant and how their code should be understood. Contemporary Japan's engagement with this legacy involves a negotiation between pride, critique, and historical honesty. The samurai remain an active presence in national conversations about identity and values. Training in martial arts did not end with the Meiji reforms. It evolved into modern Budo practices that continue to teach discipline, respect, and self-mastery. Kendo, Judo, and Aikido, among others, draw on samurai techniques and philosophies while adapting to contemporary contexts. These practices preserve elements of Bushido, honor, respect, self-control, while promoting personal development rather than political hierarchy. In this way, samurai legacies live on as personal disciplines accessible to a broad public. The cultural export of samurai narratives reshaped global perceptions of Japan, influencing artists, writers, and filmmakers around the world. Samurai tropes appear in Western films, novels, and video games, often reconfigured to suit different emotional and moral landscapes. This cross-cultural circulation shows how stories adapt and survive by finding new resonances. The samurai thus became an international mirror through which questions of honor, duty, and violence are continually explored. Economic modernization created new elites and diluted the exclusive privileges once held by samurai, but certain cultural practices persisted and were adopted by new classes seeking legitimacy. Merchants and industrialists sometimes embraced samurai aesthetics to craft reputations of stability and refinement. Cultural continuity thus outlived legal status, as symbolic capital associated with samurai manners and tastes continued to confer distinction. Identity is resilient in part because it can be appropriated and repurposed by those who seek its benefits. The samurai's relationship with technology offers a lesson in adaptability, showing both resistance and selective adoption. While initially some samurai resisted firearms and Western armaments, many later integrated these tools to preserve domains and authority. The lesson is not that samurai were uniformly conservative, but that they balanced tradition with practicality when necessary. This pragmatic streak contributed to Japan's broader ability to modernize while retaining cultural continuity. Music, poetry, and the quiet arts provided samurai with a language for grief and reflection that complemented their public virtues. In moments of loss, a haiku or an ink painting could express sorrow and acceptance without theatricality. These forms allowed private catharsis and cultivated humility, teaching practitioners to accept the ephemeral nature of life and glory. The inner life cultivated by artistic practice made the samurai more than warriors. It made them moral agents capable of deep reflection. Throughout their history, samurai negotiated the difference between legal rights and moral responsibilities, sometimes enforcing law with rigid severity and sometimes showing leniency born of compassion. The legal system could impose harsh penalties, yet judicial discretion often left space for humane governance. The interplay of law and ethics shaped many judgments about punishment, restitution, and mercy, reflecting a nuanced approach to justice rather than a single-minded thirst for retribution. Samurai funerary practices memorialized the ideal of duty and linked the living to their ancestors through ritual and remembrance. Gravesites, memorial tablets, and annual observances reinforced family stories about courage, fidelity, and sacrifice. The rituals affirmed continuity and provided models for younger generations to emulate. Death, therefore, was not only an end but a moral lesson enacted in stone and ceremony. The craft of the blacksmith, the lacquerer, and the weaver sustained samurai culture materially and aesthetically, producing objects that embodied discipline and skill. Artisans worked in close collaboration with patrons, translating martial values into durable forms that accompanied warriors through life and into memory. The material artifacts left behind, swords, armor, robes, are therefore not just relics but living testimonies to a culture of craft and obligation. They allow us to handle history and feel the weight of choices made long ago. Samurai involvement in regional governance left a lasting imprint on Japanese administrative structures, influencing how local authority and central power related to each other. The systems of tax collection, land registry, and public works born in samurai domains found echoes in later bureaucratic reforms. The administrative habits of the warrior class thus contributed to the modern state's capacity for organization and control. This bureaucratic legacy is one of the less romantic but deeply consequential outcomes of samurai rule. The samurai's engagement with philosophy included debates about the nature of human dignity and the limits of authority, conversations that resonate with contemporary concerns about leadership and responsibility. They pondered how a ruler should act, what loyalty demands, and whether obedience should be unconditional. These debates persisted across centuries because they addressed perennial moral tensions. Listening to samurai writings is to participate in a long-standing conversation about power and conscience. In the end, the samurai story is both a chronicle of institutions and a mosaic of individual lives, each negotiating the demands of honor in ways that could inspire or wound. Bushido offered a map but not a blueprint, a set of values that guided action while leaving room for interpretation and error. The legacy of the samurai is therefore messy, noble, and human. It insists on duty and discipline while acknowledging the costs those things can inflict. To understand Bushido is to understand the courage required to carry responsibility and the humility needed to wield power justly. Across centuries and through transitions from medieval battlefields to modern classrooms, the samurai adapted, suffered, and reinvented themselves. Their ethics persisted not as rigid laws but as living practices that informed behavior, shaped institutions, and inspired art. In studying Bushido, we encounter a code that regulates violence even as it sanctifies duty, a culture that prizes both beauty and lethality. The way of the warrior remains a compelling subject because it raises questions about what we owe to others and what we demand of ourselves. Walking through a museum of samurai artifacts today, one can sense the human striving behind lacquer and steel, the countless small decisions that aggregated into reputations and dynasties. Each object is a fragment of a life lived under pressure, and together they sketch the contours of a society that prized order and depth of character. Understanding these artifacts and their contexts lets us hear the voices of those who tried to live honorably in an often harsh world. Their story is a mirror and a warning. To seek virtue is to accept discipline, and to command is to accept responsibility. Even as popular media sometimes flattens the samurai into caricature, the historical reality resists easy moralizing, presenting instead a tapestry of ethics, aesthetics, politics, and human resilience. The samurai's life involved a daily negotiation of ideals and necessities, where seemingly small acts of courtesy could be as consequential as battlefield heroics. Bushido's enduring appeal lies in its insistence that how one lives matters as much as what one achieves, that inner formation precedes outer action. This lesson remains relevant in any age that must reconcile power with principle. Reflecting on the samurai invites us to consider how communities cultivate virtue and how codes of conduct can be both protective and constraining. The samurai experience shows that living by an ethic requires institutions to support it and wise leadership to prevent misuse. It teaches that honor without compassion becomes rigid, and compassion without discipline can be indulgent. The way of the warrior, therefore, presents a paradox that continues to captivate thinkers and practitioners alike. The voices of those who lived as samurai echo in historical documents, in plays and poems, and in the objects they left behind, offering a polyphony of perspectives rather than a single authoritative voice. Through diaries, treatises, and legal records we hear debates about duty, accounts of battlefield choices, and private reflections on aging and loss. These sources allow us to reconstruct a past where ideals were tested daily, and where the courage to choose rightly mattered more than the certainty of victory. The samurai thus teach that moral worth is forged in the crucible of everyday decisions. Ultimately, the study of Bushido and the samurai is not an exercise in nostalgia but a practical inquiry into how people can live with honor in messy circumstances. Their legacy challenges us to consider how communities might foster courage, temper pride, and balance loyalty with justice. It invites reflection on leadership, on the burdens of command, and on the virtues needed to sustain a life devoted to others. Listening to their story, we confront our own notions of duty and the costs we are willing to bear for principles we hold dear. The story of the samurai begins like a slow drumbeat on a dawn patrol, soft at first and then insistently shaping the horizon. In the age of the shoguns, these warriors were more than swords and armor. They were the backbone of a state that grew from the chaos of provincial rivalries into the carefully ordered world of court, castle, and capital. Picture small bands of mounted fighters answering the whistles of local leaders, then imagine those bands swelling into armies that determined who would hold power across islands of rice paddies and mountain passes. That sweep from local fighter to institutional class took centuries, and every turn altered what it meant to be a samurai. To understand the samurai under the shoguns, we have to step back to the late Heian period when central authority at the imperial court frayed and local strongmen took command. The imperial court remained a glittering center of poetry and ceremony while warriors in the provinces learned to manage resources, levy soldiers, and enforce law. These bushi, as they were often called, were initially stewards and enforcers who protected aristocratic estates, but their loyalty began to be commanded by practical ties, payouts, promises of land, marriage alliances, rather than by courtly obligation. That shift from servitors to autonomous power brokers set the stage for a new order where military might and administration fused. It was the Genpei War of the late 12th century that turned the tide decisively. A clash between the Taira and Minamoto clans that culminated in the rise of Minamoto no Yoritomo and the founding of the Kamakura shogunate. For the first time, the center of effective power in Japan was not the emperor but the shogun, a military governor whose writ ran through provincial stewards called shugo and estate managers called jito. Samurai served as the shogun's arm, expected to maintain order, collect taxes, and lead levies, while receiving fiefs and privileges in return. This was the embryo of a samurai state where military leaders now set policies and shaped the social fabric of the islands. The Kamakura period forged institutions that bound warriors to a code of conduct, if not yet the ironclad moral code later called Bushido. Loyalty, honor, and martial skill became the currency of respect. Yet life for a samurai was pragmatic. They had to administer land, settle disputes, and manage peasant production for their lord. Their world was as often about rice yield and taxation as it was about sword training. War without administration loses the capacity to remain dominant for long. When the Mongols arrived in the late 13th century, their invasions introduced a new scale of crisis. The samurai faced massive fleets and unfamiliar tactics that demanded coordination beyond the usual clan warfare. The Mongol threats forced Japan's military rulers to develop shore defenses, create standing forces, and coordinate supply lines. When the invasions failed, partly thanks to storms the chronicle calls divine, samurai prestige rose, but so did tension about rewards and recognition, because the costs were borne without the expected land allotments that victors usually receive. As the Kamakura regime faltered in the 14th century, Japan slipped into intermittent civil war again, but from this chaos came new centers of power and new models of samurai rule. The Ashikaga shogunate, which followed, ruled from Muromachi with a looser grasp on provinces, and power devolved to major families and regional warlords, or daimyo. In this era, samurai culture deepened its engagement with arts like tea, poetry, and Zen practice, partly as a social glue and partly as a way for warriors to cultivate discipline and taste. The samurai ideal transformed to include refined aesthetic sensibilities alongside battlefield prowess. The Muromachi period also accelerated the professionalization of samurai leadership. Armies grew more complex and depended on foot soldiers, arquebusiers later on, and sophisticated siege methods. Command and control became an art. Logistics and intelligence mattered as much as a champion's valor. Samurai leaders learned to negotiate alliances, betray, and consolidate, adapting older codes of honor to the ruthless necessities of securing land and revenue. The 16th century ushered in the Sengoku, the age of warring states, a time when local lords shattered certainties and battled ceaselessly to carve out domains. Samurai were now immersed in near-constant warfare, and the requirements of survival turned them into skilled administrative masters as well as fighters. New weapons like firearms arrived from Europe and changed tactics, while castles evolved from wooden fortresses to massive stone keeps with concentric defenses. In such an environment, successful samurai had to be flexible. They had to fight, govern, and innovate. Into this violent theater stepped three figures whose actions remade Japan: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Nobunaga, ruthless and visionary, used fire and steel to break entrenched power structures and to centralize authority more than any before him. Hideyoshi, once a sandal-bearer, displayed the samurai capacity for social mobility through merit and cunning, instituting sweeping policies that reorganized land and class relations. Ieyasu, patient and long-lived, converted the chaos into a stable system, founding the Tokugawa shogunate that would rule for over 2 centuries. Tokugawa rule reorganized samurai into an administrative, hereditary class tied to domains called Han. The shogunate implemented policies that restricted movement, regulated marriages, and fixed social status to preserve the order. The Sankenkotai system demanded that daimyo spend alternate years at the shogun's capital, an ingenious means of financial strain and political surveillance that kept warlords in check. In this way, samurai were integrated into a bureaucratic matrix where ceremonial duties and civil administration were as prominent as martial responsibilities. Under Tokugawa peace, many samurai found their swords collecting dust. The prolonged absence of war forced a transformation in identity. Warriors became magistrates, tax collectors, and teachers. This change produced a paradox. While samurai retained social prestige and legal privileges, their economic foundations grew precarious as stipends were fixed even as costs rose. The transformation into a governing class required education, literacy, and an ever greater engagement with Confucian thought about governance and duty. Confucian ideals shaped the moral scaffolding of the samurai in the Tokugawa era, giving rise to an elaborated ethic that emphasized loyalty to one's lord, filial piety, and personal rectitude. But this ethic was not a simple, static code imposed from above. It was debated, adapted, and practiced in various ways by different men and communities. Some samurai embraced austere discipline and self-sacrifice, while others cultivated arts and poetry as a way to distinguish their status. The cultural role of the samurai now embraced moral instruction as much as martial heritage. Education became central to samurai life. Domains established schools where the children of samurai learned not only swordsmanship but also literature, medicine, mathematics, and calligraphy. Texts on military strategy were studied alongside Confucian classics, creating a synthesis of intellectual and practical instruction. This literacy distinguished samurai from the peasantry and allowed them to serve as clerks and officials who ran the machinery of state at every level. In daily life, samurai households combined austerity with the need to display status. A samurai's home was both a place of family life and a symbol of rank, with carefully arranged rooms for guests and for the practice of arts. Armor and swords were objects of reverence as much as instruments of war, often passed down through generations and polished with ritual care. This material culture reinforced social hierarchies and connected families to a lineage of service and sacrifice. The sword, or katana, remained the samurai's most potent symbol and practical tool even when battle was rare. Forged with ritual and craft, blades were turned into repositories of family honor and spiritual identity. The pairing of katana and wakizashi, carried by samurai of certain status, created both a practical and symbolic set, one for open combat, one for closer defense or ritual. Swords were not simply weapons, they were mobile shrines and heirlooms that bound a man to his ancestors and to his lord. Armor adapted as well. In the age of shoguns, armor combined mobility and protection, evolving from lamellar constructions to designs that balanced horseback warfare and foot combat. By the peaceful Edo years, ceremonial armor became more ornamental, but its presence in parades and shrines reminded the public of a lineage of warriors who had shaped the nation's political reality. Armors, helmets, and crests bore symbols of family and aspiration, testifying to how material culture held political memory in relief. Yet alongside reverence for arms, the samurai cultivated arts that might surprise outsiders. Tea ceremony, flower arranging, and no theater became fields where a warrior's refinement was displayed. These pursuits were not mere hobbies. They taught patience, rhythm, and an appreciation for restraint, qualities useful in governance as well as war. Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on mindfulness and discipline, seeped into samurai practice, suggesting that inner calm could be as decisive as outer ferocity. The place of religion and ritual cannot be overstated. Shinto rites linked families to land and ancestors, while Buddhist teachings offered solace in times of loss and frameworks for understanding death and duty. Funerary practices, shrine visits, and household altars all reinforced a moral economy that framed service to one's lord as part of a cosmic order. Ritual structured time and obligation in a society where social cohesion depended on mutual recognition and symbolic gestures. Women in samurai families played vital and often underappreciated roles. Samurai wives managed households, oversaw finances, and sometimes led defensive actions when a household was threatened. Education for women in samurai families often included literacy and practical management skills as well as artistic refinement, strengthening family status through etiquette and competence. While men were the public face of power, women were the keepers of lineage and the administrators of domestic duties that enabled a household to stand firm. Not all samurai were servants of a strong lord. Ronin, masterless samurai, became a persistent social phenomenon with its own culture of mobility and marginality. Some ronin sought re-employment, others turned to banditry, and a few became teachers or mercenaries. Their existence highlighted the fragility of status in a world where fortunes could shift rapidly and where a single political reversal could yeet a family from prominence to obscurity. Ronin occupy a particular space in literature and popular imagination, often romanticized as tragic figures of honor without a cause. Justice and punishment under samurai rule were public, performative, and meant to reinforce hierarchy. Magistrates, often samurai themselves, presided over disputes, enforced sumptuary laws, and sometimes judged capital cases. Rituals of punishment and confession served to remind communities of the costs of disorder while reinforcing the state's monopoly on violence. Yet the administration of justice was uneven and often mediated by negotiation, bribery, and clan interests, revealing the limits of formal authority. Economic foundations of samurai power deserve attention. Samurai stipends were based on rice, the fundamental unit of wealth, paid in koku, a measure of grain sufficient to feed a person for a year. This agrarian basis tied samurai fortunes to harvests, irrigation, and peasant labor. Poor years could erode samurai comfort and even provoke fiscal crises in domains. Over time, as commerce and cities grew, a money economy took root, forcing samurai to engage with merchants and to learn fiscal management beyond the simple calculation of koku. Urban centers like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto became crucibles of culture and commerce where samurai came into daily contact with merchants, artisans, and entertainers. Edo, the shogunate's capital, swelled with samurai retinues, clerks, and administrators who participated in an increasingly urbanized life. This interaction transformed tastes, led to new forms of patronage, and blurred lines between social classes and practice, even as legal distinctions remained firm. The city recorded a new modernity in miniature, where samurai wore powdered faces to official ceremonies but walked crowded streets to do their clerical work. The relationship between samurai and merchants was complex and evolving. Merchants accumulated wealth through trade and industry, sometimes surpassing samurai in material comfort, while legally remaining below them in social status. Samurai, dependent on stipends, often extended credit or borrowed from merchants, creating webs of financial interdependence. This tension between legal prestige and economic clout shaped many of the tensions of late Tokugawa society and reminded samurai that power could be measured in more than blood and office. Trade and contact with the outside world created further pressures. European firearms introduced in the 16th century catalyzed tactical changes long before the steady drumbeat of foreign embassies and trading ships in the 19th century. The arrival of Western ideas about technology and governance forced samurai thinkers to reconsider assumptions about military and statecraft. Some advocated for selective adoption of foreign techniques, while others clung to cultural isolation. These debates would come to a head in the collision of imperial ambition and Western pressure in the mid-19th century. The arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853 was a visceral shock that exposed the shogunate's inability to defend the nation against modern naval power. The humiliations of unequal treaties and foreign encroachment fueled a nationalist response that would eventually topple the old order. Samurai from different domains mobilized intellectually and militarily, aligning with the emperor in rhetorical appeals to restore imperial rule, even as their motivations ranged from loyalty to opportunism. The result was a political storm that the Tokugawa system could not withstand. The Boshin War and the subsequent Meiji Restoration dismantled the shogunate and the feudal order that sustained the samurai. Some samurai fought fiercely to defend their domains and privileges, while others adapted and took prominent roles in the new government. The abolition of stipends and the confiscation of swords as symbols of a new modernity struck at the heart of samurai identity. Yet instead of vanishing, many samurai reinvented themselves as bureaucrats, military officers in a modern army, and leaders in industry and education. The Meiji state's creation of a conscript army replaced hereditary warrior classes with national military service, a transformation that aligned with Western models. Former samurai formed a significant part of the officer corps, translating their sense of duty and training into a new institutional framework. At the same time, the state's insistence on centralization and modernity marginalized those who could not adapt, leading to uprisings like the Satsuma Rebellion led by Seigo Takamori, a poignant last stand of the samurai spirit in a new era. The rebellion's defeat was symbolic of the end of an age and the rise of a modern nation-state. Throughout this transformation, the image of the samurai was recast in literature and art. Novelists, painters, and later filmmakers romanticized episodes of valor and loyalty even as they critiqued the social order that produced them. This cultural reimagining made the samurai a national symbol for modern Japan, a tradition cleaned of its contradictions and repackaged for civic unity. The samurai, in memory and myth, became both paragons and warnings, models of self-discipline and feudal arrogance at once. Intellectually, the samurai legacy carried forward into modern political thought. Their emphasis on duty, hierarchical loyalty, and martial readiness influenced nationalist discourse in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Military leaders and politicians found inspiration in samurai stories as they built an imperial project that drew selectively on tradition to legitimize expansion. This appropriation of samurai values shows how historical memory can be mobilized for contemporary aims, sometimes in ways that depart radically from original practice. The material culture left by the samurai, swords, armor, castles, gardens, and manuscripts, continues to captivate scholars and the public. Castles such as Himeji and Matsumoto stand as architectural witnesses to a time when defensive geometry and aesthetic presence blended in stone and timber. Tea houses, calligraphy, and gardens that samurai patrons cultivated still invite visitors into a sensibility that prized restraint and care. Museums preserve blades and armor that speak across centuries, telling the story of craft as well as conflict. The samurai's martial techniques did not vanish either. Schools of swordsmanship, spear work, and archery survived and later contributed to modern martial arts. Practices like kendo and aikido trace lineages to feudal schools, translating battlefield technique into disciplined practice suitable for civilians and soldiers alike. These arts preserved aspects of body and mind training, stance, breathing, focus, that the samurai refined over generations. The story of castles and fortifications is a story of politics made visible. Castles were centers of administration, symbols of lordly authority, and focal points in conflicts. They were built and demolished as power shifted, their forms reflecting the technological and political needs of the day. By the Edo period, many castles served as ceremonial centers more than military strongholds, their moats and walls framing the organized life of a domain. Peasant life under the samurai order was foundational to the system's stability. Farmers worked the land, paid taxes and rice, and bore the brunt of military levies and labor obligations. Their labor sustained samurai stipends and the entire administrative edifice, yet peasants were not simply passive victims. They negotiated, resisted, and sometimes rebelled when policies became unbearable. Understanding the samurai requires understanding this interdependence, where violence and governance sat atop daily labor in fields and villages. Legal frameworks under samurai rule attempted to regulate a complex society. Codes defined obligations, property rights, and criminal punishments, but enforcement was local and often improvised. Samurai magistrates drew on custom, precedent, and the needs of their domain when adjudicating disputes, blending law and discretion. The result was a legal mosaic that reflected the priorities of order, revenue, and status maintenance. Symbolism was vital. Banners, crests, and formal attire broadcast allegiance and rank in a world where visual cues mattered. Ceremonies, from coming-of-age rituals to formal audiences with a lord, reinforced social order and transmitted values across generations. The choreography of ritual made hierarchy legible and manageable in public life, transforming personal loyalty into a civic resource the state could count upon. The decline of samurai autonomy before the Meiji reforms was shaped by internal contradictions as much as by outside pressure. Hereditary stipends limited economic flexibility, while the need to project status consumed resources. Peasants struggled under tax burdens, and merchant wealth undermined the exclusive claim of the samurai to social dominance. These strains created a pressure cooker that ultimately erupted when modernizing forces exposed the state's frailties. Across centuries, the samurai developed a certain emotional language, stoicism in the face of loss, pride in family lineage, and a tragic acceptance of death as an ethical culmination. Ritual suicide, or seppuku, has been the most controversial emblem of this language, a practice rooted in notions of honor, shame, and social repair. Seppuku was not mindless violence but a socially mediated act with rules and purposes, though it has been mythologized and sometimes exploited in later historical narratives. As the world modernized, debates flourished about which aspects of samurai culture to retain and which to abandon. Reformers embraced the discipline and organizational skills of the samurai, while critics pointed to the rigid hierarchy and wartime mentality that could obstruct progress. The result was a selective inheritance. Certain values were integrated into a national identity, while many institutional structures were dismantled to make way for modernization. Colonial encounters and global war in the 20th century refracted samurai imagery into military rhetoric and national myth. Leaders used samurai stories to galvanize troops and citizens, sometimes in ways that emphasized sacrifice and obedience above critical reflection. After wars ended, cultural memory reassessed these uses, wrestling with the darker legacies of martial romanticism. Today, the samurai survive in popular culture worldwide as archetypes of discipline, refinement, and lethal skill. Films, novels, and video games have transmuted their histories into icons that are often exoticized or simplified. Yet within Japan and among scholars, the samurai remain objects of complex study, figures who straddle noble aspiration and the pragmatic necessities of power. Museums and historians continue to uncover nuances, regional differences, the role of non-elite actors, and the everyday practices that sustained the samurai as a social order. New research highlights how samurai adapted technology, formed networks across domains, and negotiated the interplay between martial prowess and governance. These studies remind us that the samurai were not monolithic but plural, evolving multiple identities across time and place. The linguistic legacy is subtle but pervasive. Many terms and metaphors in modern Japanese and in the world's literary imagination trace back to samurai practices and concepts. Words for duty, chastity, and loyalty have been shaped and reshaped by centuries of ritualized behavior. Even when the institutions vanished, the language preserved echoes that continue to influence attitudes toward authority and obligation. Tourists walking the polished streets around former castles or the quiet precincts of an old samurai district step into layered histories where public memory and lived experience overlap. Plaques in preserved buildings offer a curated narrative, but beneath them lie the messy details of negotiation, exploitation, beauty, and bravery. The samurai story is tangible in timber and stone, but it is also embodied in gestures, recipes, sewing patterns, and family stories passed down in whispers. Education on samurai history has moved beyond tales of individual heroism to include critical examinations of class, gender, and empire. Scholars interrogate how myths were constructed and deployed, how memory served political ends, and how ordinary people experienced samurai rule. This broader lens yields a richer picture that allows us to appreciate the samurai as both a cultural symbol and a real social force with concrete effects on millions of lives. In literary traditions, samurai appear as tragic heroes, loyal retainers, and sometimes as buffoons or villains, reflecting society's ambivalence toward concentrated power. Plays and novels explored the moral dilemmas of loyalty and conscience, often placing samurai on stages where personal feelings collided with public duty. These narratives served as moral laboratories where society could rehearse its values and anxieties. Modern martial ethics sometimes draw explicitly from samurai teachings, emphasizing integrity, respect, and continuous self-improvement. Practitioners who study traditional schools speak of lineage and technical continuity, but they also adapt practices to modern sensibilities about safety and inclusivity. The living legacy of samurai training is not static. It moves as practitioners reinterpret skill and meaning for new generations. Preservationists face dilemmas: how to conserve artifacts made of iron, silk, and paper while making them accessible and meaningful to contemporary audiences. Museums wrestle with display ethics, provenance, and the need to contextualize objects within broader historical narratives. Successful exhibits treat blades and armor as starting points for conversations about economy, law, and daily life, rather than as mere trophies of violence. Across the Japanese archipelago, regional differences in samurai culture remain visible in dialects, festivals, and family rituals. Some regions celebrate famous local retainers, while others honor the everyday customs that bound villages to their lords. These local memories provide texture and counterpoint to national narratives, reminding us that history is lived differently in different valleys and ports. When we listen to the story of the samurai in the age of shoguns, we hear a chorus of voices: commanders and clerks, women and peasants, artisans and ronin, priests and poets. Each voice adds a layer of meaning to what might otherwise be a single tale of conquest and rule. The samurai's history is thus not a simple march of banners, but a tapestry woven from administration, aesthetics, violence, and everyday care. What remains most striking is the samurai's capacity to adapt. From mounted shock troops to domain administrators, from sword bearers to modern officers, they reinvented themselves again and again. Their institutions shaped Japan's political geography, their arcs shaped its sensibility, and their contradictions provoked the reforms that remade the nation. In the end, the samurai are not only an artifact of the past, but a living set of narratives that continue to inform how societies think about power, duty, and identity. Listening to their story, we are invited to consider the cost of order and the price of peace. The samurai taught their society how to mobilize violence and then how to domesticate it through ritual and law. That dual heritage, capacity for both destruction and disciplined governance, has left an imprint that is difficult to disentangle from the modern nation Japan became. The samurai's age under the shoguns was, in a sense, an experiment in governance by warrior elites that lasted centuries because it successfully married coercion with administration. The long-term peace achieved under Tokugawa rule owed as much to political ingenuity as to force, and samurai were at the center of both. Their story offers lessons about institutional resilience and the sometimes slow, always messy work of building and maintaining order. In stories and in scholarship alike, the samurai remain compelling because they embody a tension between ideal and reality. They were enshrined as paragons of virtue even while functioning within a system of inequality and coercion. Their lives call on us to keep asking hard questions about virtue, power, and the social structures that shape human choices. We end this telling without closing the book, because the samurai continue to appear in new forms and new arguments. They are discussed in classrooms and debated in parliament, invoked in films and tattooed on skin, studied by scholars and romanticized by dreamers. Their history under the shoguns is thus an ongoing conversation between past and present, a conversation worth keeping alive. Long before the twilight of the samurai, their story began as a practical response to a chaotic world. Small bands of warriors gathered to protect land, enforce justice, and serve local lords in an archipelago where power was often measured by the sword. Over centuries, those bands were organized into a distinct social class, bound by duty, etiquette, and an unmistakable code of honor. Their armor, swords, and rituals became symbols of a nation organized around feudal loyalty and martial responsibility. By the time the Tokugawa shogunate secured peace in the early 17th century, the samurai had become the ruling class on paper and a class apart in daily life. The long period of stability called the Edo era rearranged samurai purpose. Warriors who once fought daily now administered domains, collected taxes, and governed villages. Peace multiplied paperwork instead of battlefields, and etiquette replaced immediate violence as the measure of a samurai's worth. The transformation from warrior to bureaucrat set in motion tensions that would eventually unravel their dominance. The Bakufu, the shogun's government, established a rigid social order with samurai at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants. This order was protective and limiting at once. Samurai enjoyed status and stipends, but their income often lagged behind rising costs, especially as the economy expanded and urban life flourished. Merchants, officially low in status, accumulated wealth that samurai could not touch, and the resulting social friction began to reshape notions of honor and security. Stipends were small, fixed sums paid by feudal lords to support their samurai. These payments seldom rose with inflation or with the needs of an evolving society. Many samurai lived in domain castles or nearby towns where their expectations of living standards collided with shrinking purchasing power. Some took up side professions, teaching, writing, or small businesses, practices that at first seemed demeaning but later became more common as financial survival required flexibility. Another mechanism that shaped samurai life was senkinkotai, the system by which daimyos alternated residence between their domains and Edo, the shogunate's capital. This system kept potential rivals close to the political center and helped the bakufu maintain control. It also imposed heavy travel and lodging costs on the samurai who accompanied their lords, and the expense of maintaining two households stretched domain finances. Over time, these logistical burdens contributed to the increasing indebtedness of many domains and eroded the old economic foundations. As towns and ports grew, a new urban culture emerged that prized commerce, fashion, and entertainment. The merchant class invested in theater, publishing, and the tea houses of pleasure quarters, creating a vibrant culture that drew samurai into unfamiliar spaces. Some samurai took to literature, calligraphy, or the study of classics to reclaim dignity in changing times. Others chafed at the decline of martial practice, feeling a spiritual and social emptiness as swords saw less use on the battlefield. The samurai's identity was not simply about warfare, it was an intertwined web of ethics, ritual, and performance. The word bushido, which later became shorthand for the samurai moral code, did not exist in a single, canonical form during most of their history. Instead, ideals of loyalty, filial piety, bravery, and self-discipline were taught through practice and example. When economic and social structures began to shift, those ideals were tested, and different samurai responded in very different ways. By the early 19th century, the country faced new external pressures that accelerated internal changes. European powers, industrializing and expanding by sea, looked to Asia for trade and influence. Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships arrived in 1853, a moment that signaled to many Japanese the urgent necessity of catching up or facing colonization. The sight of Western cannon and steam propelled diplomacy into a new era and exposed the limits of the traditional samurai's power to defend coastal domains or negotiate with foreign governments. The unequal treaties that followed opened Japanese ports to foreign trade and extraterritorial rights for Westerners. For many samurai, especially those in the provinces, this humiliation was intolerable. The image of a bakufu unable to protect the nation undermined its legitimacy, and calls to restore imperial rule or expel the foreigners gained traction. This political ferment was not purely ideological, it was also a practical assertion that the existing leadership had failed to adapt to a changing global order. Within this growing unrest, two intertwined currents shaped the samurai response: loyalty to the emperor and backlash against the Tokugawa regime. Sano Joi, the slogan to revere the emperor and expel the barbarians, captured a potent mixture of nationalism and xenophobia. Many samurai rallied around the idea of returning direct authority to the imperial court in Kyoto as a moral antidote to the bakufu's failures. This movement gathered momentum unevenly across domains, but it found particularly fertile ground in southwestern provinces such as Satsuma and Chashu. Satsuma and Chashu, two powerful domains far from Edo, became the crucible of revolution. They had strong military traditions and a history of independence, and their leaders recognized the need for modernization to resist Western pressure. Samurai reformers in these domains began acquiring Western weapons, studying foreign techniques, and restructuring their local administrations. Their experimentation created a revolutionary core that combined samurai ethos with a willingness to borrow foreign technology and organizational models. The alliance between Satsuma and Chashu was not inevitable, but once formed it proved decisive. Diplomatic skill, shared interests, and common enemies bound these domains together against the shogunate. Behind the scenes, samurai of different ranks and backgrounds negotiated the delicate balance between radical change and stability. Figures such as Seigo Takamori from Satsuma and Kido Takayoshi from Chashu embodied the complex mix of traditional honor and progressive ambition that drove the movement forward. Not all samurai supported the idea of dismantling the Tokugawa order. Loyalists preferred reform from within or a careful, gradual adaptation that preserved elements of the old system. The shogunate itself attempted to modernize, creating new arsenals, sending men overseas to learn, and forming modernized military units. But these efforts were often too little and too late, hampered by corruption, outdated logistics, and a fundamental reluctance to reimagine the social hierarchy that had underpinned Tokugawa rule. The assassination of reform-minded figures and the outbreak of violent incidents in port cities sharpened divisions. Some samurai, increasingly restless and often unpaid, became ronin, masterless warriors. These ronin were unpredictable. Some turned to banditry, others to ideological causes, and a minority to political assassination. The presence of many disaffected samurai added a volatile human element to an already tense political landscape, increasing the likelihood of conflict and making compromise harder to achieve. In 1867, the last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, faced a collapse of authority that was both swift and symbolic. Political negotiations, pressure from powerful domains, and a changing military reality overwhelmed the old regime. The Meiji Restoration that followed declared the restoration of imperial rule, and with it came a new political center determined to modernize and centralize power. For many samurai, the restoration felt like a vindication. For others, it was the first step in the dissolution of their social order. The Meiji leaders were pragmatic and uncompromising. They recognized that Japan had to transform rapidly to stand on equal footing with Western powers. Central government reforms targeted the very foundations of feudal life, domain boundaries, samurai privileges, and economic systems. The goal was clear: create a modern nation-state with a centralized administration, a national army, and an economy integrated into global markets. One of the earliest and most consequential reforms was the abolition of the Han system, the domains controlled by daimyos. In 1871, the government replaced these semi-autonomous territories with prefectures directly governed by the central state. This move dissolved the old power base of many samurai and redirected loyalty from local lords to the national government. For samurai who had defined themselves through service to their lord and domain, this administrative revolution created a profound sense of dislocation. Closely tied to the abolition of the Han was the restructuring of samurai stipends. The government initially promised to maintain payments to former samurai as part of the transition, but it soon became clear that such a fiscal burden was unsustainable. Stipends were converted into government bonds or reduced, and the practical means of maintaining samurai households vanished. Many former samurai found themselves without stable income, forced to seek new livelihoods in a rapidly modernizing economy. Another seismic reform was conscription. In 1873, the government introduced a national army based on universal male conscription instead of reliance on samurai as a hereditary military elite. This move democratized military service and deliberately undermined the samurai's monopoly on armed force. For a class that had equated honor with the right to bear arms, being asked to accept commoners as comrades and commanders cut deeply into prestige and identity. The new military also preferred modern weapons and tactics. The government invested in training, imported rifles and artillery, and sent students abroad to study military science. Samurai had to adapt or be sidelined. Some embraced the change, finding roles as officers or military instructors, while others saw their specialized skills as obsolete. The shift in military culture was both practical and symbolic, signaling a Japan that would fight with technology and discipline rather than feudal valor alone. To reorganize society further, the Meiji leaders introduced legal and educational reforms. The samurai class, recognized as a distinct legal category, was eventually abolished, and citizens were reclassified with new civil statuses. Public education expanded, teaching a shared national narrative and practical skills necessary for industrialization. For former samurai, whose training had been steeped in classical scholarship and martial arts, the new curricula presented both a challenge and an opportunity to remain relevant in a transforming society. Cultural markers of samurai status were also targeted in the drive to modernize. The Heitoriai Edict of 1876 banned the wearing of swords in public by many former samurai, a symbolic act meant to remove visible signs of privilege and to promote public safety. The sword had been the physical and spiritual emblem of the samurai, and ordering it removed from public view felt like an erasure of identity for many. The Heitoriai was met with deep resentment, and for some it signaled the irreversible end of an order they had served for generations. Economic modernization offered both promise and peril. Railway lines, factories, and new forms of commerce began to transform the landscape. Some former samurai seized opportunities in finance, government bureaucracy, or education and prospered. Others lacked the capital, skills, or inclination to transition easily. The uneven distribution of opportunity created social frictions, and pockets of poverty among erstwhile samurai fueled resentment and nostalgia for a lost social standing. The Meiji state's emphasis on centralized control and Western models of governance produced a new elite, often referred to as the oligarchy or Meiji leaders. Many of these figures had samurai backgrounds, but they did not hesitate to dismantle the feudal structures that had empowered their ancestors. They saw themselves as modernizers who had to make hard choices to ensure national survival. The paradox was stark. Samurai-born statesmen were instrumental in creating a world where samurai as a class no longer mattered. Despite the state's reforms, resistance took dangerous and dramatic forms. The Boshin War of 1868 to 1869 was a civil war that pitted pro-imperial forces, largely from the southwestern domains, against shogunate loyalists. Battles such as Toba-Fushimi and the March to Edo culminated in the peaceful surrender of the capital in some instances and fierce fighting in others. The war marked the military end of Tokugawa rule, but it also highlighted how deeply samurai loyalties could compel men to fight for cause, tradition, or survival. Even after the restoration and the legal abolishment of many samurai privileges, dissident samurai continued to organize. One of the most famous episodes of resistance was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Seigo Takamori, a revered samurai who had become disenchanted with the direction of the new government. The rebellion was romantic and tragic, fueled by a sense that honor and proper place had been stripped away from samurai. The last stand at Shirayama, where Seigo fell, became a powerful symbol of the end of an era. Seigo's death was more than a military defeat, it was a cultural and emotional rupture. Many in Japan mourned him as a hero who had tried to reconcile tradition with change, while others saw him as an obstacle to necessary national reforms. The suppression of the rebellion signaled the irreversibility of Meiji policies and the state's capacity to use modern military force to maintain order. For many samurai, the message was clear: resistance would end in defeat against a state committed to a new path. Another form of resistance was legal and literary, expressed through petitions, essays, and fiction. Former samurai and intellectuals debated the future of the nation, the role of honor, and the ethics of modernization. Novels and plays began to wrestle with the samurai's changing identity. Authors explored themes of loss, nostalgia, and the uneasy synthesis of old virtues with new realities. This cultural introspection helped Japan navigate the psychological aspects of transformation even as laws and institutions changed. The state also co-opted elements of samurai culture to forge a modern national identity. Rituals, symbols, and ethical language were reinterpreted to serve the emperor-centric narrative of Meiji Japan. Bushido was reframed as a national ethic, used to encourage loyalty to the state and sacrifice for the emperor rather than exclusive fealty to a feudal lord. This selective appropriation allowed the government to retain the moral capital of samurai values while decoupling them from hereditary privilege. Western observers sometimes misunderstood these cultural reinventions, reading samurai codes through their own lenses. European and American writers romanticized the samurai as the Japanese knight or noble savage, a simplification that flattered popular imagination but obscured nuance. Meanwhile, Japanese thinkers negotiated how to project power and modernity while preserving a distinct cultural identity. The tension between authenticity and adaptation shaped both domestic discourse and foreign diplomacy. Economic measures attempted to address the fiscal strains that drove much of the samurai unrest. The government modernized taxation, issued new currency, and promoted industrial investment. Land reforms and the promotion of private enterprise encouraged capital accumulation, though benefits were often uneven. Former samurai who could transition into roles as entrepreneurs, bureaucrats, or teachers found new forms of influence, while those who could not faced marginalization. Education became a crucial battleground for shaping the future citizenry. The government established schools across the country, teaching science, modern languages, and civic discipline. Former samurai, with their literate backgrounds, were well positioned to become educators and administrators, and many did. The spread of literacy and technical knowledge created a skilled workforce for industry and a new elite of professionals who owed their status to merit and training rather than birth. At the same time, the modern legal system sought to replace feudal obligations with codified rights and duties. Judicial reforms created courts, laws, and bureaucratic procedures modeled in part on Western examples. People were, in theory, equal before the law, a radical departure from a society structured by inherited rank. For former samurai, who had enjoyed special legal privileges, this leveling felt like both a loss and a modernization that could bring national strength and fairness. Industrialization reshaped landscapes and labor relations, offering both hope and dislocation. Factories required discipline and wage labor rather than the feudal loyalties of the past. Some samurai adapted by entering corporate management, engineering, or administrative positions within emerging industries. Their training in discipline, study, and moral rectitude served them well in the offices and institutions of a modernizing state, even as rural samurai struggled with the decline of traditional roles. Urbanization accelerated the dissolution of old social communities and introduced diverse lifestyles. Former samurai who moved to cities encountered middle-class professionals, foreign traders, and a cosmopolitan culture that prized efficiency and innovation. The anonymity of urban life allowed some to reinvent themselves without the weight of local expectations. Yet urban success was uneven, and the juxtaposition of prosperity and poverty underlined the human costs of rapid transformation. Religious and philosophical currents also shifted in response to the samurai's decline. Shinto was elevated as a state ritual system to legitimize the emperor, while Buddhism and other traditions adjusted to a new public role. Samurai spiritual practices, often syncretic, found new expressions in private discipline or in the public cult of national service. The moral language of duty was retuned to support a centralized state, creating a bridge between old virtues and new expectations. The presence of Westerners in Japan changed cultural tastes and material life. Clothing styles, architecture, and culinary options began to reflect global influences. For samurai, whose dress and bearing had been markers of status, adapting to Western fashions caused friction and creative reinterpretation. Some embraced Western suits and military uniforms as signs of modernity and seriousness, while others held tightly to traditional garments as symbols of continuity. The Meiji state's foreign policy ambitions also influenced the samurai's legacy. As Japan modernized its military and economy, it sought to renegotiate its position in East Asia and the world. Victories in conflicts like the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War demonstrated that the nation could adopt Western technology and organization effectively. These triumphs were, in part, the result of a society that had shed feudal constraints and mobilized resources for national projects. In time, the samurai image was mobilized by the state to inspire military valor in a modern context. Soldiers and officers were taught a version of Bushido meant to encourage discipline and sacrifice for the nation. This rebranding was selective, emphasizing loyalty to the emperor and endurance rather than feudal service to a local lord. The adaptation had consequences. Some versions of Bushido were later exploited to justify militarism, a development that cast a long and fraught shadow over the samurai legacy. Cultural production, novels, theater, art, continued to interrogate what the samurai had meant and what their decline signaled for Japan's soul. Writers like Natsume Soseki and Mori Oge explored themes of alienation, duty, and identity that resonated with a population in transition. Artists depicted samurai in nostalgic or critical lights, sometimes romanticizing their heroism and other times exposing the human costs of rigid honor. These works helped the nation remember and reassess its past amid rapid modernization. In academic and public memory, the samurai underwent continual reinterpretation. Scholars traced the historical evolution of samurai institutions, while the public engaged with an idealized image that blended fact and fiction. Museums, ceremonies, and literature kept samurai stories alive, and these narratives shaped national identity, tourism, and education. The samurai's decline, therefore, was not simply an ending but the beginning of a long conversation about continuity, memory, and reinvention. Internationally, the image of the samurai fascinated foreigners who sought exotic models of courage and discipline. Samurai swords and armor became objects of collection, study, and often misinterpretation. Diplomatic interactions carried the weight of this fascination, as Japanese leaders presented their nation as both modern and steeped in an honorable past. The balance eased anxieties at home by binding a proud heritage to the credentials of modern statehood. The material culture of the samurai did not vanish with legal changes. Swords, lacquerware, and household treasures passed into museums, private collections, and new hands. For many families, heirlooms provided continuity across chaotic decades, objects around which personal narratives of honor and loss could coalesce. The care and interpretation of these items became a field of cultural preservation, linking future generations to a complicated past. As Japan industrialized and centralized, social mobility increased for some but stagnated for others. The old binary of samurai and commoner gave way to a more complex social map. Merchants became industrialists, bureaucrats rose on merit, and peasants became wage laborers in factories. Former samurai sometimes found new ways to exert influence through education, law, and commerce, reframing their identity in professional rather than hereditary terms. This evolution produced a modern elite that was partly descended from samurai and partly created by the new economic order. The legal abolition of samurai status was not merely a bureaucratic act, it was a redefinition of what it meant to belong to a community. Citizenship replaced class in political discourse, and loyalty to the emperor replaced fealty to a lord. Pensions and stipends were reallocated, and titles were transformed into civic roles and honors. The social fabric shifted from localized obligation to national rights and duties, a seismic moral and practical reordering. The samurai's martial arts were not destroyed, they evolved. Practices like kenjutsu, later reframed as kendo, adapted to new educational and sporting contexts. Martial culture found new life in schools and dojos, where discipline and physical training were taught as character building rather than purely combative skills. These arts preserved elements of technique and philosophy while adapting to a society less defined by warfare and more by regulated competition and discipline. Public ceremonies and rituals took on new meanings as the state sought to build national cohesion. Imperial processions, military parades, and state funerals incorporated elements once associated with samurai pageantry but recast to celebrate national unity. For people who had lived through the shift, such spectacle could be both comforting and alienating, a reminder that the past had been repurposed to serve a different future. The conversion of stipends into bonds and the promotion of new industries created a nascent capitalist order that was volatile and creative. Some former samurai who entered banking and commerce became influential industrialists, bending their organizational skills to the needs of a growing market economy. The discipline of samurai training, regimentation, attention to duty, the habit of literacy, proved surprisingly transferable to modern corporate life for those who could seize opportunities. Yet for many families, the psychological loss of status lingered. Stories of once proud lineages reduced to poverty circulated widely, and these narratives fueled a cultural ache that found expression in literature and nostalgia. The sense that a world had ended became a recurring theme, not only a social reality but a moral question about what should be preserved and what must be surrendered in the march of progress. The samurai's decline thus became a moral lesson debated in drawing rooms and lecture halls alike. The Meiji state's selective preservation of samurai virtues influenced education, law, and military training throughout the 20th century. The language of sacrifice, loyalty, and honor could be harnessed to inspire national unity and mobilization. This rhetoric was powerful and sometimes dangerous, especially when deployed to justify warfare and empire. The complexity of the samurai legacy, therefore, included both constructive civic virtues and a potential for authoritarian misuse. In households and local shrines, families continued to honor samurai ancestors through memorials and storytelling. Lineage became a private inheritance of values as well as objects. These domestic practices kept alive a memory of service that did not fit neatly into the public narratives of modernization. Personal remembrance allowed individuals to mourn, celebrate, and reinterpret the past in ways that official histories might not permit. As Japan entered the 20th century and engaged in imperial expansion, the image of the samurai was occasionally invoked to foster martial spirit among soldiers and citizens. Militaristic applications of samurai symbolism during wartime blurred lines between cultural pride and propaganda. After the devastation of World War II, Japan underwent a different kind of transformation, and post-war interpretations of the samurai were often critical and reflective, questioning the ways traditional virtues had been co-opted. Scholarly debate about the samurai's nature and decline continued to evolve. Historians examined archival records, personal letters, and domain accounts to understand the economic, social, and ideological forces at play. Their work showed that the samurai class was not a monolith, but a diverse group with competing interests and varying capacities to adapt. This complexity undercut simplistic romanticizations and allowed for a richer understanding of the human experience behind institutional change. In the post-war era, popular media reimagined samurai figures in novels, films, and television dramas, offering audiences heroic, tragic, or critical portraits. Directors and writers used the samurai as a lens to explore contemporary issues, honor, criminal justice, duty, and personal autonomy, making the past relevant to modern concerns. The samurai's aesthetic remained potent, the silhouette of a sword, the quiet dignity of a code, and the drama of personal choice all resonated with audiences searching for moral reference points in a rapidly changing world. Globally, the samurai captivated scholars, martial artists, and enthusiasts who studied Japanese history and tradition. Dojos outside Japan taught sword arts derived from samurai practice, often blending physical skill with philosophical reflection. Museums hosted exhibitions showing armor, swords, and paintings, helping international audiences grasp the complexity of a class that had once ruled by force and later vanished by law and economics. In contemporary Japan, the samurai legacy is multiple and sometimes contradictory. Tourists flock to castles and festivals that celebrate samurai culture, while academic debates continue about the ethical dimensions of their history. Politicians and public intellectuals occasionally invoke samurai virtues in speeches about responsibility and leadership, though these appeals are interpreted in different ways by different audiences. The samurai remain a living cultural reference precisely because their story resists a single conclusion. The global fascination with the samurai also raises questions about appropriation and myth-making. Foreign admirers sometimes cherry-pick heroic aspects while ignoring the complexities of feudalism, social inequality, and militarism. Responsible engagement with the samurai past requires attention to both admirable practices and problematic legacies, balancing admiration with critical inquiry. This balanced view allows the samurai to be appreciated without becoming an unexamined idol. The material transformation of Japan, railways, telegraphs, factories, modern universities, was powered by a human transformation as well. People, including many of samurai origin, became managers, engineers, bureaucrats, and educators who built institutions designed to sustain a modern nation-state. Their success in creating a unified polity capable of industrial competition owes as much to cultural adaptation as to structural reform. The decline of the samurai class, then, is inseparable from the creation of a dynamic national society. Memory work, how a nation remembers its past, is central to understanding the samurai's afterlife. Museums, textbooks, and monuments choose which stories to emphasize and which to neglect. The choices made in these venues shape collective identity and political culture over generations. The samurai continue to serve as resources for imagination, offering narratives of courage, failure, and reinvention that people draw upon to make sense of present dilemmas. The samurai's decline also teaches a broader lesson about how societies undergo painful transformations. It shows how legal change, economic pressure, cultural reinterpretation, and political calculation intertwine. Some people adapt quickly and prosper, others mourn and resist, and institutions try to manage transitions with varying degrees of justice and foresight. The Japanese experience during the Meiji Restoration becomes a case study in the often brutal arithmetic of social modernization. Even as the visible power of samurai faded, their ethical vocabulary persisted in many forms. Concepts of duty, discipline, and service remained attractive and were woven into the ethics of public officials, teachers, and business leaders. This moral residue derived from samurai culture continued to inform debates about leadership and citizenship, proving that values can outlive the institutions that originally embodied them. Adaptation, rather than simple erasure, characterized the samurai's final passage into modernity. Artistic representations continued to explore the samurai's interior life, its doubts, its contradictions, and its capacity for both nobility and cruelty. Poets, painters, and playwrights found in the samurai a rich subject for meditating on impermanence and moral choice. The samurai provided a language through which Japan could articulate anxieties about modernity, nostalgia for lost order, and hopes for a renewed ethical life. The legal and social dissolution of the samurai class did not erase personal bonds of loyalty and kinship. Families that had served for generations continued to care for ancestral graves, hold ritual occasions, and tell stories that preserved family identities. These microhistories accumulate into a more textured national memory, linking the distant past to the lived experiences of ordinary people. Personal continuity softened the sharp edges of institutional rupture and kept the samurai alive in the private imagination. The Meiji government's success in forging a modern state depended on talented individuals who could bridge old and new worlds. Many of these leaders were former samurai who had embraced reform and used their authority to build new institutions. Their stories complicate a simple narrative of victim and victor. Within the samurai class were architects of transformation as well as defenders of tradition. Understanding this internal diversity is key to grasping how the samurai's decline unfolded in practice. The fate of the swords themselves is emblematic of the broader transformation. Once tools of war and symbols of personal honor, swords became artifacts, artworks, and sometimes trophies of a passing world. Conservators and collectors preserved blades and mounts for posterity, while the ethical meanings attached to them shifted from active duty to curated history. The sword's journey from companion to museum piece mirrors the samurai's own trajectory from ruling class to historical memory. As scholarship deepened, historians challenged myths and looked at the samurai's decline through new lenses: economic analysis, social history, and comparative studies. They examined land records, family registries, and fiscal documents to reconstruct how policy decisions impacted daily life. These granular studies revealed the everyday pains and adjustments people endured, bringing nuance to sweeping narratives about revolution and progress. The micro-level stories complemented grand political accounts and enriched historical understanding. Public commemorations of the Meiji Restoration increasingly reflected a nuanced appreciation of its costs and benefits. Official narratives celebrated modernization and national strength while acknowledging the sacrifices it required. Ceremonies that once glorified singular achievements now sometimes include remembrance for those who suffered in the process. This evolving public memory demonstrates how nations continually reinterpret their transformations with an eye toward moral complexity. Outside Japan, the historical arc from samurai dominance to modern nationhood influenced other societies undergoing similar pressures of imperialism and modernization. Observers in Asia and beyond studied Japan's ability to rapidly industrialize and centralize power, sometimes hoping to emulate its success. The samurai's decline, therefore, took on international significance as a model for how traditional elites might either adapt or be swept aside in a global age of empires and markets. Generational shifts played a subtle but important role in the samurai's decline. Young men educated in new schools often looked with impatience on the rituals of their elders, seeking practical skills and careers in industry or government. Their willingness to embrace new identities accelerated cultural change, producing a cohort that identified more with national modernity than with feudal memory. Generational turnover thus helped cement the transformations that legal reforms initiated. Literary and cinematic reimaginings of the samurai have continued to stir the imagination, creating archetypes that adapt to contemporary moral debates. The solitary ronin, the conflicted officer, the tragic idealist, these figures recur in stories that probe courage, loyalty, and the costs of violence. By reframing the samurai myth in modern settings, creators keep the ethical dilemmas alive and relevant, inviting audiences to wrestle with questions that have no easy answers. Economically, the samurai's decline coincided with the rise of a corporate and financial order that rewarded different skills and ambitions. Entrepreneurship, bureaucratic competence, and technical expertise shaped new pathways to influence. Former samurai who could translate their discipline into administrative acumen often thrived, while those attached exclusively to status found fewer opportunities. The redistribution of privilege reflected a world organized around markets and institutions rather than hereditary office. The story of the samurai's decline is also a story about law and legitimacy. The Meiji state's legal reforms sought to create a rational, predictable framework for governance that would command obedience on its merits rather than through feudal custom. This reconfiguration of authority required time and resources but ultimately enabled Japan to negotiate with Western powers on more equal terms. The sacrifice of samurai privileges thus functioned as part of a broader bargain for national sovereignty and modernization. In modern education and public discourse, there is an ongoing effort to teach the samurai's history in ways that neither romanticize nor demonize. Curricula try to present the samurai as complex historical actors whose actions were shaped by circumstances, choices, and imperfect institutions. This balanced approach allows citizens to draw lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the moral pitfalls of unexamined tradition. It keeps the samurai's legacy alive in a spirit of critical reflection rather than nostalgia alone. The Meiji Restoration's architects often justified their reforms with the argument that Japan had to centralize and modernize to survive in a world dominated by industrial powers. This utilitarian logic resonated with many, even as it prompted deep pain for those whose social worlds were dismantled. The calculus of survival versus tradition shaped public debates and personal fortunes alike, making the samurai's decline part of a larger tale about national fate and moral choice. Regional differences complicated the samurai's decline. Urban samurai experienced different pressures than rural ones, and domains with stronger industrial bases adapted more quickly than agrarian regions. The diversity of local outcomes meant that the samurai's end was not a single event but a mosaic of transitions, some peaceful and some violent. These local variations remind us that national reforms are implemented unevenly and that human lives are marked by contingency as much as policy. Memory, adaptation, and institutional innovation together produced a complex afterlife for the samurai. Their values lived on in reinterpreted forms, their institutions were repurposed or dismantled with varying degrees of fairness. The overall arc, decline, resistance, reinvention, speaks to the broader human capacities for loss and renewal. The samurai story thus offers a powerful lens through which to view the dilemmas of modernity itself. In public ceremonies and private recollections alike, the samurai continue to function as a moral mirror, reflecting what a society values and fears. The sword that was once drawn in battle now appears in museum glass cases, on movie screens, and in academic footnotes, each context giving it different meanings. The samurai's physical absence makes their symbolic presence more potent, allowing them to serve as a repository for varied interpretations and aspirations. To listen to the samurai's decline is to hear a chorus of voices, statesmen, ronin, teachers, peasants, writers, and grieving families, each telling a part of a larger drama. Their stories intersect at the point where feudal order meets the modern world and must either dissolve or reconfigure. The Meiji Restoration was the stage on which this reconfiguration was enacted, and its consequences shaped Japan's path into the 20th century and beyond. The tensions between tradition and innovation that marked the samurai's final decades continue to resonate in contemporary debates about cultural preservation and progress. Societies everywhere wrestle with how to honor heritage while embracing necessary change. The samurai's decline thus remains instructive, a cautionary tale about the costs of rigidity and a hopeful example of how values can be transformed rather than simply extinguished. In the end, the samurai did not vanish so much as disperse into the institutions of modern Japan. Their bloodlines continued, their stories were retold, and their virtues were redeployed in new contexts. The Meiji Restoration did not erase the past, it redirected it, converting a feudal order into a modern nation through a combination of force, persuasion, and cultural reimagining. The samurai's decline was not an apocalypse but a metamorphosis. Today, as people walk through preserved castle towns or read novels set in the Edo period, they engage with echoes of a society that once lived by sword and oath. The lessons of those echoes are complex. Honor can be noble, but it can also be brittle. Tradition can ground a people, but it can also impede survival. The story of the samurai's decline in the face of the Meiji Restoration remains a vivid chapter in the human saga of change, resilience, and the search for a moral compass in uncertain times. Listen, and I will take you across centuries, through mud and court gardens, through metal and silence, to trace how the samurai live on in the present day. This is not a dry lecture, but a slow walk through streets where the echo of armor has become the click of high heels and the hum of trains. We will move from battlefield to boardroom, from shrine to screen, and discover the threads that tie modern life to a class that once swore its fate to blade and lord. Keep your hands on the wheel if you must, but let the details settle in like a steady hand finding the rhythm of a cut. Begin with a single word, Bushido, which has come to mean many things since it first sketched itself across the memory of Japan. To some it is an ideal, a shorthand for courage, loyalty, and self-discipline. To others it is a myth, a later invention that polished rough realities into moral gemstones for a changing nation. In the 19th century, as the samurai class was dismantled and Japan raced to modernize, poets, scholars, and politicians rewrote the past and made Bushido into a civic creed. That rewriting matters because the version of Bushido many people carry in their minds today is as much a product of modern imagination as it is of medieval practice. The samurai were warriors, yes, but they were also administrators, land managers, and cultured men who wrote poetry and practiced calligraphy. Under the Tokugawa peace, martial skill conceded space to governance and culture, and the samurai became bureaucrats in fine armor, patrons of the arts as well as custodians of local order. In schools and tea rooms they learned refinement, in stables and training halls they preserved martial discipline, and those dual practices forged a temperament that could be adapted to new roles. When the Meiji leaders dissolved hereditary privileges, they could not dissolve a habit of service and order that had already seeped into the national bloodstream. You can still feel that seepage in how Japan organizes itself. The disciplined punctuality of trains, the meticulous attention to craft, the quiet deference in many public interactions, these are not direct descendants of sword culture so much as cousins, but they are related by a lineage of habits. Corporate culture often borrows the language of loyalty, duty, and rank in ways people outside Japan notice in interviews and films. Executives talk about commitment and team, employees endure long hours in part out of a cultivated sense of responsibility. These are modern echoes of an older ethic of service to a lord and to a system that was larger than the self. The Meiji Restoration was the hinge that turned medieval loyalty into modern nationalism, and it did so violently and decisively. Samurai rebels who could not accept the loss of status took up arms. Other former samurai found places as officers and administrators in the new imperial army and government. The image of the sword-wielding warrior was repurposed to justify modernization and expansion, and that repurposing left a complicated inheritance. In the decades that followed, reverence for the samurai became entangled with state power, and the samurai ideal could be invoked to demand obedience as readily as it could be used to inspire artistic devotion. Across the 20th century and into the present, samurai imagery has been both celebrated and critiqued, and those debates shape how people think of them today. After the wartime use of militaristic rhetoric, many Japanese confronted the dangers of conflating honor with blind obedience, and scholars began to unpack the myth beneath the myth. Cultural critics and historians asked which parts of the samurai story had been exaggerated, which had been suppressed, and why certain qualities were elevated while others were muted. Those investigations did not erase the samurai's appeal, instead they refined it, allowing newer generations to adopt elements selectively and with more awareness. In modern popular culture, the samurai has become a global figure, a symbol reshaped in Hollywood studios, anime studios, and independent films alike. Akira Kurosawa's films, especially Seven Samurai, reframed the samurai as tragic heroes and practical leaders, and those films fed imagination in both Japan and abroad. Hollywood borrowed Kurosawa as freely as Japan borrowed Western cinema. Elements of samurai narrative found their way into westerns and space operas, and the noble loner, the Ronin, became an archetype far from Japanese shores. Today, games and television continue the work of translation, rendering samurai tropes into swords that slice through pixels and cultural barriers alike. That translation is not always faithful, and sometimes it is freeing. Video games like Ghost of Tsushima and Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice let players inhabit a stylized past where swordplay and honor are expressed in immersive environments, while anime series reinterpret the samurai with punk sensibilities, mixing history and fantasy in ways that delight and provoke. These reinterpretations distill certain aesthetics, stoic resolve, minimalism, ritual motion, into elements people can wear, perform, and share. Cosplay events, film festivals, and academic conferences all test different versions of the samurai, producing a chorus of voices that argue over authenticity and invention, sometimes all at once. But the samurai's legacy is not only found in entertainment, it permeates Japan's living practices, from martial arts to tea ceremonies, from sword-making to festivals. Kendo dojos around the world teach disciplined footwork and kata that are, in spirit and in detail, descendants of the battlefield. Aido preserves the ritual of drawing and sheathing a sword, a practice in which the motion itself becomes a meditation on readiness and restraint. These arts train not just bodies but minds, asking practitioners to balance aggression and control, to move with purpose, and to empty themselves of needless thought in moments when reaction matters. Swordsmiths are another vital bridge. The craft of making a katana was perfected over centuries, a marriage of metallurgy, tempering, and geometry that produced a blade both flexible and strong. Today, master smiths keep those techniques alive, working in small studios and workshops where the rhythm of hammering and folding steel sounds almost like prayer. Those smiths are not relics, they are living artists who respond to commissions, restorations, and the market created by collectors and museums. Laws and regulations govern the making and ownership of swords in modern Japan, and these bureaucratic layers shape who can practice the craft and how the blades can travel beyond national borders. Museums play a large role in the samurai's presence in modern life, and exhibits that display armor, helmets, and letters invite visitors to imagine the men who once wore them. Curators frame these objects with narratives that emphasize artfulness, cruelty, discipline, or service, depending on the curatorial aim. Restoration work on castles and armory collections revives physical spaces where memory can be staged, and tourists who wander reconstructed ramparts feel a tactile connection to a distant past. These sites are not neutral, they are places where memory is curated, and the choices curators make help form the public's understanding of who the samurai were. Walk through a reconstructed castle town and you will find more than stone and timber, you will find living memory and commerce braided together. Craftspeople sell lacquerware, fans, and fabric dyed with patterns that once marked a retainer's station. Actors or volunteers in period costume perform reenactments, waving banners and shouting phrases that mimic old orders. Tourists pose with swords, book lessons in sword handling, and purchase souvenirs shaped like helmets and masks. These are performances of identity that both educate and entertain, and they show how the past has been commodified in service of present curiosity and regional economies. We should also speak of women, whose stories are often quieter but no less important. Anabugeisha, female warriors, existed in the same historical currents as male samurai, and names like Tomoguzen resonate because they challenge simple narratives of a male-only warrior culture. Samurai households taught daughters literacy, tea, needlework, and sometimes martial skills needed to defend hearth and home. In modern reinterpretations, women of the samurai world have become central figures in novels, films, and scholarship, reclaimed from marginalization and explored with new empathy and complexity. Language carries the samurai forward as well. Castles and streets retain names that recall clans and battles, while polite phrases and hierarchical terms in modern Japanese reflect a social grammar that was shaped by centuries of rank and deference. Honorifics and careful speech are not relics, they are active parts of communication that can gatekeep or smooth social interaction. Political rhetoric occasionally reaches back to samurai metaphors, invoking duty or sacrifice in contexts that range from philanthropy to mobilization, and those metaphors have weight because they resonate with a long oral history. Religion and philosophy also trace lines from samurai practice into modern spiritual life. Zen Buddhism influenced the samurai's approach to life and death, encouraging directness and a focus on presence that complemented martial training. Tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and ink painting offered samurai ways to temper aggression with beauty, teaching that restraint could itself be a form of power. Today, many people practice meditation, tea ceremony, or other arts without choosing the samurai label. Yet those practices carry structural echoes of a past where aesthetic discipline and ethical training were intertwined. The imperial regalia, including the sacred sword, have a potent symbolic role that persists in state ceremonies and in the cultural imagination. That symbolism ties the figure of the warrior to the idea of national continuity and sacred lineage, a continuity that matters to many people for reasons that range from nostalgia to identity. Some of the samurai legacy is ritualized in state and local ceremonies that still use sword imagery, whether in festivals or formal rites. These rituals remind citizens and visitors that history is not only recorded in books but performed each year in processions, prayers, and the careful maintenance of relics. At times, the samurai legacy has been a source of troubling memory. The use of samurai ideals to justify militarism in the early 20th century left traumas that scholars and activists still confront. Debates over history textbooks, commemorations of war, and political speeches occasionally reignite arguments about how samurai virtues were manipulated in service of imperial aims. A mature engagement with the past acknowledges both the beauty and the danger in those ideals, refusing simple nostalgia in favor of nuanced understanding. Contemporary thinkers in Japan and abroad continue to wrestle with how to remember honor without condoning aggression. Yet memory is never singular, and within Japan there is a lively conversation about what the samurai mean now. Some people find comfort in the idea of steady service and craftsmanship, others resist the hierarchical inflections of that past. Artists remix samurai aesthetics into modern forms, designers incorporate armor motifs into fashion, chefs reinterpret warrior symbolism into themed dining experiences, and scholars publish work that complicates older myths. All these responses show that the samurai are not a fossilized object, but a live source of inspiration that gets refracted by each generation's needs. Education is another area where samurai ideas have left marks, subtle and explicit alike. School curricula long included moral instruction that echoed the samurai's emphasis on duty and loyalty, and while modern education aims for pluralism, the echoes remain in classroom discipline and civic education. Field trips to castles and museums are still common, and children learn of battles and figures whose stories are framed to convey certain values. How those stories are told, heroic, tragic, critical, affects how young people imagine themselves and their nation's past. In practical institutions, vestiges of samurai culture appear in the police, in the self-defense forces, and even in business hierarchies. Drill and discipline in uniformed services have obvious antecedents in the martial classes, but modern training emphasizes law, ethics, and civilian oversight in ways that a feudal order did not. Corporate rituals and seniority systems sometimes mirror samurai ranked relationships, though economic pressure and globalization have forced many companies to adapt more flexible practices. The tension between tradition and innovation is a working element in contemporary life, where tradition offers stability, modernity demands agility. The aesthetics of the samurai, simplicity, asymmetry, natural materials, and appreciation for imperfection, have informed Japanese design and, through it, global tastes. Wabi-sabi, an aesthetic that values transience and imperfection, is often associated with the tea ceremony and the sensibilities that shaped samurai culture. Designers from architecture to fashion have been inspired by the restraint and focus that samurai-generated arts prized. The result is a visual and material vocabulary that travels easily, applied to interiors, technology, and clothing with the same reverence for subtlety that once went into a sword's hamon. Food, too, bears imprint. The samurai household's cuisine was mindful of seasons, balanced in taste, and often prepared to satisfy the needs of travel, training, or ceremony. Modern interest in regional foodways and in dishes that evoke a simpler past has made some elements of samurai diet fashionable again. Restaurants that recreate period meals draw customers who want to taste what history felt like, and chefs experiment with old recipes to produce new flavors that honor tradition while catering to contemporary palates. The legal and bureaucratic residue of feudalism transformed into modern institutions in ways that still shape the public realm. Land registration, family registries, and civil codes that developed during Meiji were influenced by a need to reconcile old status with new citizenship. The way people relate to property, inheritance, and family obligations still carries traces of a pre-modern mindset that prized lineage and continuity. Those structures are not unchanging, but they have longevity precisely because they were adapted rather than discarded during a tumultuous period of reform. For the global audience, the samurai are often shorthand for a certain kind of heroism, disciplined, stoic, and strangely solitary. That image appeals widely because it fits narrative desires for character and conflict, someone who follows a code in a world that ignores it. But the popular image can flatten complexities, turning a multifaceted social class into a single archetype. Scholars and storytellers who resist that flattening offer richer portrayals: the samurai as manager, as poet, as husband, as bureaucrat, as occasional criminal, and as a person embedded in networks of family and obligation. Political movements have occasionally used samurai symbolism to whip up sentiments or to anchor arguments. Far-right groups in Japan and elsewhere sometimes invoke warrior imagery to argue for purity, order, or national pride, while leftist critics may point to class exploitation and coercion embedded in a feudal past. That contested symbolism demonstrates the malleability of historical figures. The same past can be mobilized in opposing directions depending on contemporary aims. Public debate about monuments, textbooks, and official ceremonies continually reworks the meaning of samurai icons in civic life. In the realm of craftsmanship, the preservation of lacquer, textiles, and armor-making techniques has become a cultural priority. Craftspeople and restoration experts relearn ancient methods so that when a helmet or a cuirass is damaged by age or accident, it can be repaired with respect to original techniques. A whole ecosystem of small businesses sustains these arts, from ironworkers to lacquerers to textile dyers, and that ecosystem is supported by enthusiasts and museums that commission or conserve objects. This care for objects is itself a cultural practice that values continuity and patience. On the street level, modern Japan hosts an array of samurai-themed eateries, theaters, and escape rooms that allow patrons to encounter the past in playful ways. You can sit in a recreation of a daimyo's dining room and sample dishes served as if in mid-Edo, or you can join a theatrical battle where actors mimic old tactics for modern audiences. These entertainments are not mere kitsch, they are ways people engage with history actively, choosing how to remember, which parts to emphasize, and how to make the past present without claiming it wholly. They reveal aspiration as much as nostalgia, an attempt to inhabit values thought admirable in a palatable, consumable form. The global collector market for samurai swords and armor has led to both preservation and controversy. Valuable blades end up in private hands or foreign museums, and provenance matters, which pieces were taken during military occupations, which were sold legally, and which were traded in ethically gray zones. International legal frameworks and academic networks work to trace histories and return items when necessary, while collectors argue for preservation under any stewardship. These debates reflect broader questions about who owns the past and how it should be shared. Academic inquiry has deepened our understanding of samurai life, moving it beyond myth and into empirically attested social history. Historians use temple registries, family letters, land records, and legal documents to reconstruct the economic lives of retainers, their debts, marriages, and daily hardships. Anthropologists study ritual and family practice, while literary scholars examine how samurai produced and consumed texts. This multidisciplinary approach strips away easy romanticizations and presents samurai as people who negotiated the same messes we still face: obligations, ambitions, love, and fear. The samurai's weaponry itself tells a story of technological and aesthetic evolution. The katana evolved to meet changing battlefield conditions, to balance reach with maneuverability, and to express a craftsman's skill in steel and tempering. Armor changed too, becoming lighter or heavier depending on tactical needs, and helmet crests announced affiliation in ways that were both practical and symbolic. Each change in material culture maps onto shifts in warfare, economics, and fashion, and studying those artifacts reveals how ordinary life and extraordinary moments intersected. Local festivals remain a durable source of samurai memory, where communities celebrate or mourn the deeds of ancestors with music, banners, and parades. A town might reenact a famous defense, parade scaled armor, or hold a solemn remembrance for those who died in battle generations ago. These festivals knit community identity to historical narrative, and they are often tied to place, in a field, on a hill, beside a shrine, where the story is felt as much as told. Participation in such events keeps history embodied rather than abstracted, and it invites reflection on continuity and change. Not every modern use of samurai imagery is reverent. Marketing departments use katana silhouettes to sell cars, advertisements borrow stoic faces for insurance pitches, and pop culture sometimes trivializes the gravity of samurai ethics. Yet even commodified images can spark curiosity, leading listeners and viewers to investigate deeper histories. The conversation between commodification and curiosity is ongoing. Sometimes the shallow image opens a door to thoughtful engagement, and sometimes it shuts the subject into a caricature that is hard to recover from. What of the descendants of samurai families? Some lineages preserve records and artifacts with care, passing down family crests and stories. Others have assimilated into broader society, the titles dissolved but the memory retained in a family tale or a treasured object. In modern Japan, family registries can still show connections to samurai ancestors, though those connections are more genealogical than feudal. For many individuals, such heritage is a quiet part of identity rather than a public claim to status. Cross-cultural exchange has made the samurai an international school of inspiration in the practice of martial arts and ethical training. Westerners who study kendo, aikido, or kenjutsu bring back discipline and aesthetic sensibilities that they then integrate into their own cultural frameworks. Dojos overseas adapt teaching methods and etiquette to fit different expectations, producing a globalized practice that keeps core elements while allowing local variation. This process creates communities that are transnational in spirit, connected by practice rather than geography. The samurai also appears in political cartoons, literature, and satire where the figure is used to critique or lampoon contemporary behavior. Cartoonists draw politicians as stubborn retainers, novelists depict the lingering effects of honor culture and bureaucratic dysfunction, and comedians play with the image of rigid discipline in contexts where flexibility is needed. Satire is a form of engagement that forces a society to confront its contradictions, and the samurai, being a potent symbol, often finds itself at the center of such critiques. In the field of mental health and wellness, modern practitioners sometimes borrow samurai metaphors to teach focus, resilience, and boundary setting. Therapists and coaches use stories of controlled breathing, deliberate action, and presence in training clients to face stress with steadier nerves. These uses are metaphorical, not literal. They translate tactic into practice, offering clients a model that has emotional clarity. The samurai, as a pedagogical tool, thus moves from history into personal transformation, where its core lessons are adapted to contemporary needs. Fashion designers and artisans reinterpret armor motifs into contemporary clothing, carving space for the samurai aesthetic in modern wardrobes. Elements like layered garments, asymmetrical cuts, and muted color palettes borrow from the visual grammar of armor and kimono. Hoodie and kimono hybrids, leather pieces with the silhouette of shoulder guards, and jewelry that hints at a helmet crest are examples of how designers pay homage without copying historic garments. These adaptations show the samurai's visual language remains potent, adaptable, and appealing in new contexts. Digital culture has amplified the samurai presence in ways unimaginable a century ago. Fan communities debate the most authentic sword strike, create art that blends eras, and produce fan fiction that places samurai in futurescapes. Social media feeds allow Japanese museums to reach global audiences, and live-streamed events bring distant voices into conversation over armor restoration, martial demonstrations, and scholarly debate. The Internet has, in effect, extended the dojo and the archive, allowing practice and research to cross borders with ease. Historical fiction and creative nonfiction continue to be fertile ground for samurai stories, offering readers and listeners a way to inhabit past minds without sacrificing modern sensibilities. Authors who take care with research can create narratives that illuminate the textures of life, what a morning looked like in a samurai household, how a winter ration was shared, how a young retainer learned to tie his obi. These detailed accounts humanize figures who can be flattened into archetypes, and they invite empathy as well as critique. Good storytelling, after all, is one of the most effective ways to transmit complex cultural legacies. The museum catalog, the docent's talk, the reenactor's shout, the scholar's footnote, all these act together to make a living memory that is contested, curated, and performed. Nobody owns the samurai story wholly. It is a public good shaped by institutions, families, artists, and consumers. That plurality is healthy because it prevents a single narrative from monopolizing meaning. Still, plurality can also cause fragmentation, leaving listeners to choose which version resonates with their own ethical frame. Technology also changes the way weapons and armor are studied. Imaging techniques like X-ray fluorescence and metallography reveal the inner life of blades without damaging them, and 3D modeling reconstructs an armor's mobility for study and exhibition. These tools allow historians to test theories about how armor was used, how swords were made, and how a helmet might have affected mobility. Modern science provides new evidence that updates old assumptions, making historical interpretation a more empirical endeavor than it once was. The samurai's presence in education for foreigners has an interesting duality. It serves as an accessible entry to Japanese history and as a bridge to deeper cultural understanding. Programs that teach language and etiquette often include modules about samurai history because the topics captivate learners and contextualize social practices. Study tours to Kyoto, Nara, and castle towns allow students to juxtapose monuments with modern urban life, fostering a nuanced view that resists exoticization. Such educational work requires sensitivity to avoid fetishizing the past while appreciating its formative role. Museums and cultural centers sometimes confront ethical dilemmas when exhibiting items associated with violence or oppression. How do you display a sword that is both a work of art and a tool for killing? Curators balance aesthetic appreciation with contextualization, offering visitors narratives that acknowledge brutality, artistry, and the social conditions that produced both. Thoughtful exhibitions invite reflection rather than celebration, asking what we can learn from artifacts about human capacity for creation and destruction. The samurai as a symbol of masculinity has been interrogated by contemporary gender studies, which point out that the idealized warrior model excluded many people and imposed a narrow conception of honor. Feminist scholars highlight the lives of merchant women, peasant mothers, and samurai wives, showing how gender roles intersected with class and duty. Recovering women's voices and acknowledging the emotional labor of households produces a fuller portrait of the samurai era. Modern conversations about masculinity and vulnerability often return to samurai imagery, either to adopt certain virtues or to reject harmful stereotypes. Artistic practice has kept samurai aesthetics alive in subtle ways. Woodblock prints, ink painting, and calligraphy traditions continue to inspire contemporary artists who translate historical motifs into modern media. Artists borrow the dramatic lines of an armor silhouette, the grain of a sword blade, or the starkness of a warrior portrait and reframe them within contemporary concerns. These works circulate in galleries and online, offering viewers a way to see continuity rather than rupture between past and present. Art becomes a space where the samurai is not only remembered but also critiqued and transformed. There are also entrepreneurial stories that tie the past to the present, shops in small towns that survived by pivoting from making samurai goods for local needs to selling to tourists and collectors. These small businesses often rely on intergenerational knowledge, with children learning lacquering, dyeing, or blade polishing from elders who can no longer do heavy work. Their survival depends on a mix of authenticity, storytelling, and the ability to connect with a global marketplace. In that way, the samurai legacy supports livelihoods as well as memory. In literature, the samurai has been used to explore existential themes: honor versus survival, loyalty versus conscience, public duty versus private feeling. Great novels and plays make room for interiority, showing how a samurai might wrestle with choices that are morally ambiguous. These texts resonate because they take timeless human dilemmas and ground them in a cultural framework that is both specific and universal. The struggle to reconcile codes with circumstance is reflective of human life across cultures and eras. Cinema continues to be an especially powerful medium for samurai stories, capable of marrying visual spectacle with intimate drama. Directors use framing and movement to make swordplay into choreography that is both thrilling and meaningful, transforming combat into a language of character. Modern filmmakers experiment with time, mixing archival footage, CGI, and theatrical performance to explore the past in ways that are fresh and emotionally compelling. Film festivals dedicated to period dramas broaden the audience, inviting viewers to engage with history in communal ways. Tourism boards and cultural ministries often promote samurai heritage as an attraction, and this marketing encourages regional revitalization. Towns that were once strategic castles now compete for visitors by hosting hands-on experiences, building museums, and restoring walkable historic districts. Tourism can bring prosperity, but it also risks simplifying complex histories to fit a narrative that sells well. The best initiatives balance spectacle with scholarship, providing visitors with a sense of place that is neither glossy nor reductive. The samurai legacy is also present in ceremonial practices that survive in unlikely places, such as graduation ceremonies, where speeches sometimes invoke duty and perseverance, or in corporate rituals that mark promotion and retirement. These modern rites borrow the language of transition and obligation, turning personal milestones into public affirmations of continuity. Ritual, after all, is how societies mark passage and define values. When samurai language appears at these moments, it signals an ongoing aspiration toward order and meaning. Environmental relationships from the samurai era, such as reverence for certain trees, stones, and streams near shrines and castles, continue to influence conservation efforts. Sacred groves and castle moats are preserved not just for their ecological value but also for the cultural significance they represent. Conservationists sometimes work with shrine caretakers, local governments, and historians to protect landscapes that are both natural habitats and repositories of memory. This convergence highlights how cultural heritage and environmental stewardship can reinforce one another. Public monuments that commemorate samurai figures are sites of debate about memory and recognition. Some monuments honor military leaders as national builders, while others emphasize victims of conflict and the costs of war. Decisions about which figures to memorialize and how to interpret them reflect current political and ethical priorities. These debates are healthy for a democratic society because they force continual assessment of the past's role in public life. The samurai have also informed modern leadership studies, where executives and coaches examine historical figures for lessons on strategy, morale, and crisis management. Case studies about famous generals or clan leaders are used to teach decision-making under pressure, to analyze the limits of loyalty, and to study the relationship between leader and retainer. While these comparisons are necessarily selective and metaphoric, they serve as useful prompts for contemporary reflection about leadership's ethical dimensions. A lesser-known legacy involves legal historians tracing the transition from feudal codes to modern legal systems. Samurai courts and dispute resolution mechanisms provided models for early civil procedures, and the shift to Western-style law in Meiji era required translating old forms of obligation into codified statutes. This legal history matters because it shaped the modern citizen's relationship to the state and to notions of individual rights versus collective duty. Understanding that transition clarifies why certain legal norms persist and why others were abandoned. The samurai's influence extends into intangible practices such as etiquette and hospitality. The manners expected at formal gatherings, bowing, careful speech, precise seating, retain echoes of hierarchical order. Hospitality, or omotenashi, can be read as an extension of a social ethic that prized serving a guest with dignity and respect. These practices are not rigid fossils, they are living behaviors that people adapt depending on context, but their lineage can sometimes be traced back to a culture that prized form and proper performance. There is also a quiet resilience in communities that preserve samurai archives and family chronicles, often in temple libraries or municipal archives. Scholars and amateur historians comb through these sources to build mosaics of everyday life, lists of rations, household inventories, records of gifts and punishments. These minutiae may seem trivial, but together they paint a rich, textured portrait of what social relations actually looked like, beyond the grand narratives of battle and heroism. Technology companies in Japan and abroad occasionally brand approaches to product development with samurai metaphors, associating discipline, craft, and user focus with the warrior's dedication to mastery. Mastery as a corporate value borrows the ideal of relentless improvement that once characterized martial practice. How companies interpret that ideal varies. For some it is a call to obsessive quality control, for others it is a cautionary tale about balance between work and life. These corporate adoptions show how versatile the samurai image can be when translated into goals for contemporary production. At the grassroots level, community groups organize workshops to teach children about history through hands-on activities like mock armor making or calligraphy. These programs aim to build a sense of continuity across generations, encouraging young people to appreciate local history without inheriting narrow ideology. Hands-on learning makes the past tangible, allowing kids to feel the weight of a helmet or the smoothness of a blade replica, while teachers frame the exercise with critical reflection rather than blind veneration. This method fosters curiosity and discernment simultaneously. Resistance literature and films sometimes subvert samurai tropes to critique contemporary power structures, portraying samurai not as noble protectors but as enforcers of unfair order. These counter-narratives remind audiences that every tradition has instruments of oppression and that historical figures can be both admirable and culpable. Such works are essential to a robust cultural conversation because they refuse to let nostalgia eclipse accountability. They complicate the image and encourage ethical engagement with past legacies. The samurai remain fixtures in the international imagination because they evoke a compelling mixture of art and violence, discipline and solitude. That resonance is partly aesthetic, partly moral, and partly narrative. The figure of a person bound by a code who moves through a dangerous world provides endless dramatic possibilities. People who are attracted to stoicism, craft, and ritual find in samurai history a set of practices they can adapt. Those who reject rigid codes find in the same history a cautionary tale about the limits of honor divorced from compassion. In the academy, interdisciplinary teams continue to reevaluate sources, testing received wisdom and opening new interpretive possibilities. Archaeologists excavate battlefields to recover material evidence, economists quantify landholdings and retainer incomes, and environmental historians explore how resource management shaped samurai power. These research programs complicate earlier narratives and offer more democratic access to the past, helping the public understand that history is a conversation, not a proclamation. Finally, consider the moral ambivalence that the samurai legacy invites. There is beauty in a well-made sword and horror in the violence it was meant to enact. There is nobility in disciplined service and injustice in the social orders that demanded obedience. Modern life allows us to take the elements we find useful, discipline, craftsmanship, courage, and to reject the elements that serve domination or exclusion. The samurai remain a mirror, reflecting our desires to be skilled and brave, and our need to temper those desires with empathy and discernment. Subscribe to join those who see the samurai as both inspiration and warning, and comment below, do you admire their discipline, condemn their injustice, or both?